somewhere beneath the desert sand of Abydos, in the burial ground of a civilization so old that it predates the Great Pyramids by 1,000 years, there is a tomb. Not a modest tomb. Not the modest burial of a minor official or a successful merchant. A tomb that was, at the time of its construction, among the largest and most architecturally complex structures in the known world. A subterranean palace of mud brick and timber, divided into rooms, stocked with thousands of objects, surrounded by the graves of the people who served the man it was built for, and who were buried alongside him at his death. A tomb that was later enlarged, modified, equipped with a staircase entrance that was the specific architectural innovation of a specific royal mind, the mind of the man buried inside it. The man buried inside it was a king, not the king of a province or a city, but the king of the unified Egyptian state, the lord of the two lands, the ruler of the Nile Valley, from its southern reaches in the first cataract region to its northern dissolution in the delta marshes, the man who wore the double crown. His name was Den. He ruled Egypt somewhere around 2900 BC, according to current scholarly estimates, more than 5,000 years ago. He was, by the evidence of the objects recovered from his tomb and the inscriptions carved on small ivory and ebony labels found alongside them, the most administratively sophisticated ruler Egypt had yet produced. He reformed the system by which the Egyptian state managed its agricultural resources. He conducted military campaigns against the peoples of the Eastern Desert. He standardized the administrative records through which the Egyptian state tracked its income. He introduced the specific royal title, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, that would remain the primary designation of the pharaoh for the next 3,000 years. He also appears, in a famous ivory label found at Abydos, to be the first Egyptian king depicted striking a foreign enemy, the first visual representation of the smiting pharaoh, the image of divine royal violence against the forces of chaos that would decorate the walls of every major Egyptian temple for the next 3,000 years. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Den was, but what the specific combination of his administrative innovations, his symbolic contributions, and his architectural ambitions reveals about the extraordinary moment in human history when one of the most sophisticated civilizations the world had ever produced was still finding the forms that would define it for the next 3,000 years. Let that sink in. 3,000 years of subsequent Egyptian history, the pyramids, the New Kingdom Empire, the late period dynastic conflicts, the Ptolemaic synthesis, all of it building on the specific institutional foundations and the specific symbolic vocabulary that rulers like Den were assembling in the first centuries of unified Egyptian kingship, the double crown that Den wore, the administrative title he adopted, the smiting pharaoh image he may have been the first to use, the specific architectural innovations of his tomb. All of these became permanent features of Egyptian civilization, not because some committee decided they should be permanent, but because they were the specific solutions that the specific intelligence of the first dynasty worked out for the specific problems of governing the world's first unified state. This is the moment before the pyramids, the moment before the priests of Amun and the campaigns of Ramesses and the libraries of Alexandria, the moment when everything that would later be called Egyptian civilization was still being invented, when the specific people who would define it were still alive, still making choices, still producing the forms that would endure. Den was one of those people. He was one of the most important of them, and he is one of the least known outside the small world of specialists who study the first centuries of Egyptian history. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. The world into which Den was born, the world of the first dynasty of Egypt, roughly 5,000 years ago, was a world so different from anything that came after that the modern imagination struggles to hold it. There were no pyramids, there were no hieroglyphic inscriptions covering temple walls, there was no Nile-spanning bureaucratic apparatus managing the annual flood and the agricultural cycle with the smooth efficiency of 3,000 years of accumulated institutional knowledge. There was no Amun or Ra or Osiris in the fully elaborated theological forms that later Egyptians would take as the eternal bedrock of their civilization. There was a recently unified state still working out the administrative forms that would allow it to function. There was a king who wore a crown that declared, in symbolic language, that he ruled both the southern valley and the northern delta, both of the two distinct geographic and cultural worlds that the Egyptian state had unified, probably through a combination of conquest and negotiation, in the generation or two before Den was born. There was a court, a system of record-keeping that was still developing, and a burial tradition that was producing, at Abydos, the most architecturally ambitious tombs that any human being had yet built anywhere on Earth. This was the world of Den, and it is a world worth understanding on its own terms, not simply as the embryonic form of the more familiar Egypt that came later, but as a specific civilization in a specific moment, working out fundamental questions about governance, symbolic legitimacy, and the nature of royal power that had never been worked out before because no civilization had yet faced them at this scale. The working out is the story, and it starts with the site where the evidence is buried, the royal cemetery at Abydos, and the specific moment when modern archaeology began to uncover what was there. To understand Den, you need to understand what Abydos is, and what it was, and why the specific place on the western bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt, in the territory of modern Sohag Governorate, became the burial ground of the first kings of Egypt. Abydos is one of the oldest continuously occupied sacred sites in the world. People have been venerating it, burying their dead near it, building temples at it, and making pilgrimages to it for more than 5,000 years. In the late period, in the era of the pharaohs described in the earlier chapters of this series, Abydos was the sacred city of Osiris, the god of the dead, and it was the destination of pilgrims from across Egypt who came to participate in the mystery plays of Osiris's death and resurrection that were among the most important ritual events in the Egyptian religious calendar. In the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian nobles competed for the right to build cenotaphs at Abydos so that their souls could participate in Osiris's eternal passage, even if their bodies were buried elsewhere. All of this later religious and cultural significance grew around a specific fact. The first kings of Egypt were buried at Abydos. Their tombs were there. The tombs of the earliest pharaohs, the kings of the first and second dynasties, who ruled Egypt in the centuries immediately following its unification. These tombs were known, in the later period, as the burial place of Osiris himself. The god of the dead had been identified with the king who had died, and eventually, as the mythological tradition developed, with the first kings specifically. The royal necropolis at Abydos became the most sacred burial ground in Egypt, the place where the divine king was most directly present in the landscape. But in Den's time, 5,000 years ago, in the First Dynasty, the mythology had not yet fully developed. What was at Abydos was the practical reality of a royal necropolis, the burial ground that the founders of the Egyptian unified state had chosen for their tombs, maintained and expanded by successive kings, developing across the first centuries of unified Egyptian rule into one of the most archaeologically complex sites in the ancient world. The specific reason the first kings chose Abydos for their burial place is itself a question that modern Egyptology has been working on for more than a century. The site is located in Upper Egypt, in the region associated with the pre-dynastic kingdom of Hierakonpolis, whose rulers may have been the ancestors or predecessors of the First Dynasty. The choice may reflect the specific regional power base from which the unified Egyptian state was created, a signal that the kings who unified Egypt understood themselves as the successors and inheritors of a specifically southern, Upper Egyptian tradition, even as they now ruled the whole Nile Valley. The discovery moment for the modern scholarly understanding of early Egyptian history. The specific moment when the archaeology of the First Dynasty began to become a serious field rather than a collection of anecdotes and poorly understood objects, came in the 1890s of the modern era, when the British archaeologist Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie arrived at Abydos and began the systematic excavation that revealed the extent of the early royal cemetery. Petrie was, by this point, already one of the most experienced field archaeologists in the world. He had been working in Egypt since the 1880s, developing and refining the systematic stratigraphic methods that transformed Egyptology from treasure hunting into a genuine scientific discipline. He had worked at Naucratis and at various delta sites and at the Pyramid of Hawara, and he had developed, through years of fieldwork, the specific combination of meticulous excavation and rigorous documentation that made his work at Abydos so foundational. When Petrie arrived at Abydos in 1899 CE, he was not the first European archaeologist to work at the site. The French archaeologist Émile Amélinot had been excavating the royal necropolis since 1895, with results that were significant in terms of objects recovered, but problematic in terms of excavation technique. Amélinot's work was the work of a man primarily interested in finding objects rather than in understanding contexts. The specific archaeological sin of the 19th century, which produced museum collections at the cost of the stratigraphic and contextual information that would have made those collections scientifically meaningful. Petrie's arrival at Abydos was in part a response to the damage that Amélinot's work had done. He went back over the same ground with the specific goal of recovering what systematic archaeology could still recover from the disturbed contexts that Amélinot's excavations had left. What he found, both in the undisturbed portions of the site and in the careful re-examination of the disturbed areas, transformed the understanding of early Egyptian history. Standing at the edge of his trenches at Abydos in 1900 CE, Petrie found himself looking at the remnants of structures that predated everything he had previously encountered in his decades of Egyptian fieldwork. The mud brick walls, the timber roofing traces, the extraordinary concentration of grave goods, the ivory labels, the stone vessels, the pottery, the small carved objects that filled the fill of the looted royal tombs. He was looking at a civilization that had been functioning at a level of organizational complexity and artistic sophistication that the existing scholarly consensus had not anticipated for this period. He was looking, though he could not yet fully articulate what he was seeing, at the first dynasty of Egypt. The scale of what he was uncovering was difficult to convey even to specialists who were following his work closely. The Egyptian state, at the dawn of its unified existence, had been capable of organizational and material achievements that pushed the limits of what modern scholars had assumed was possible for a polity at this stage of institutional development. The tombs themselves, the architecture, the scale, the deliberate and systematic provisioning of the royal dead demonstrated levels of administrative capacity and ideological sophistication that required fundamental revision of the scholarly understanding of Egyptian state formation. Petrie's reports from Abydos were, by the standards of Victorian archaeological publication, models of measured scholarly restraint, but the specific objects he was recovering and describing and publishing and cataloguing were extraordinary enough to generate significant scholarly excitement even in the measured prose of a field report. Ivory labels incised with minute hieroglyphic signs, stone vessels carved with a precision that was not matched in European workshop traditions for another 2,000 years, small cylinder seals and stone tablets recording numerical information in a script that was recognizably related to, but distinctly different from, the mature hieroglyphic writing system of the later periods. The chronological implications of what Petrie was finding were themselves profound. He was dealing with material that predated the Old Kingdom, the era of the great pyramid builders, already understood to be among the oldest phases of Egyptian civilization, by a significant and not yet fully measurable interval. The first dynasty was earlier than the Old Kingdom. How much earlier was not yet clear, but the material was pushing the origins of Egyptian civilization further back into the past than the existing scholarly consensus had assumed. The scholar who would eventually do the most to transform Petrie's foundational work into a systematic understanding of First Dynasty Egypt was the German Egyptologist Werner Kaiser, who in the 1950s and 60s of the 20th century conducted a series of detailed reanalyses of the Abydos material that established the chronological framework and the institutional history of the First Dynasty that remains the basis of the current scholarly understanding. Kaiser's work, meticulous, systematic, drawing on every available category of evidence, was the specific scholarly achievement that made it possible to talk about Den and the other First Dynasty rulers as specific individuals with specific reigns and specific contributions, rather than simply as names attached to archaeological deposits. The picture that Kaiser's work and the subsequent work of the scholars who have built on it produced is the picture of a civilization in the specific and extraordinary moment of its own founding. The first dynasty of Egypt was the dynasty of invention, the dynasty in which the specific forms, the specific institutions, the specific symbolic vocabulary of Egyptian civilization were being worked out for the first time. Every subsequent dynasty inherited those forms. The first dynasty created them. Den was one of the creators. By the evidence of his tomb and the objects it contained and the administrative records that his reign produced, he was one of the most significant creators of the entire First Dynasty. Understanding what he created requires understanding what Egypt was when he came to the throne, and what it had been immediately before in the generation or two of unified Egyptian history that preceded his reign. The unification of Egypt, the specific historical event or process by which the two distinct cultural and political regions of the Nile Valley, the narrow strip of Upper Egypt in the south, and the broad fan of the Delta in the north, were brought under the authority of a single king, is one of the most discussed and most contested questions in the entire field of Egyptology. It is also one of the most difficult to answer with any precision, because the evidence for it is fragmentary, because the process itself was probably gradual rather than instantaneous, and because the specific people who participated in it were not leaving the kind of documentary record that would allow a detailed reconstruction of how it happened. What the archaeological evidence does show is a specific pattern of change in the Nile Valley in the period between approximately 3200 and 3100 BC, according to current scholarly estimates. The material culture of the Delta region, the pottery styles, the architectural forms, the burial practices, becomes progressively more similar to the material culture of Upper Egypt. The specifically Upper Egyptian pottery and administrative traditions begin to appear at sites in the northern part of the Nile Valley. The evidence for long-distance exchange networks connecting distant Nile Valley communities becomes more concentrated and more organized, and the specific burial practices of the Abydos Royal Cemetery begin to show an increasing elaboration and standardization that suggests the development of a specifically royal ideology, a systematic set of ideas about what kingship was, what it required, and how it should be expressed. The scholar who has done the most to synthesize this complex archaeological picture into a coherent narrative of Egyptian state formation is Toby Wilkinson, whose work on the early dynastic period, particularly his comprehensive monograph published in 2001 CE, brought together the full range of archaeological evidence for the first and second dynasties and placed it in the broadest available comparative and theoretical context. Wilkinson's synthesis demonstrated, among other things, the extraordinary speed with which the specifically Egyptian royal ideology developed in the first centuries of unified rule, the speed with which the symbolic vocabulary, the administrative infrastructure, and the territorial organization of the Egyptian state were assembled into the distinctive form that would remain essentially stable for the next 3,000 years. That speed is one of the most extraordinary things about the First Dynasty. The mature Egyptian state, the state with its hieroglyphic writing, its pharaonic ideology, its administrative system, its specific relationship between the king and the gods and the land, appears in the archaeological record with a speed that has surprised every generation of scholars who have looked carefully at the evidence. The Egyptians did not develop their characteristic civilization slowly, over centuries of gradual cultural evolution. They developed it with remarkable rapidity in the first few centuries of unified rule, as if the specific problems of governing a large, complex, geographically diverse state generated specific solutions at a pace that the pressure of necessity demanded. Den came to the throne after several generations of this rapid development. He was not the first king of the first dynasty, The dynasty had been founded by a ruler whose name is conventionally rendered as Nama, followed by Aha, Jet, and the woman ruler Mernith, who may have served as regent before Den. Each of these rulers had contributed to the developing institutional and ideological framework of the Egyptian state. Each had built at Abydos. Each had managed the administrative challenges of the unified kingdom, and each had died and been buried in the royal necropolis in tombs that were, with each successive generation, more elaborate, more architecturally complex, and more richly provisioned than the ones that preceded them. By the time Den came to the throne, and the specific chronology is uncertain, with scholarly estimates placing his reign somewhere between 2900 and 2800 BC, according to current models. The Egyptian state had been in existence for somewhere between 2 and 4 generations. It was not new, but it was also not yet the mature, stable, institutionally deep civilization that it would become. It was still in the process of developing the specific forms that would define it. Den developed several of those forms in ways that the subsequent history of Egypt made permanent. The double crown, the combined red crown of Lower Egypt and the white crown of Upper Egypt, worn together in a single headpiece that symbolized the ruler's sovereignty over both lands, had existed as a symbolic concept before Den. The separate crowns are known from earlier First Dynasty and even pre-dynastic representations, but the specific evidence suggests that Den was the first king to consistently use the combined title King of Upper and Lower Egypt, the specific two-land royal designation that would remain the primary formal title of the Egyptian pharaoh for the next 3,000 years. This is not a minor administrative detail. The specific formulation of the royal title, the insistence on the dual character of Egyptian kingship, the explicit acknowledgement that the ruler of Egypt was the ruler of 2 originally distinct lands that had been unified, was a fundamental statement about the nature of Egyptian royal ideology. It said, "This kingdom is not simply a large territory. It is a specific unity of 2 distinct entities, and the king who rules it holds that unity together by the specific force of his divine authority." The dual character of Egyptian kingship, expressed through the double crown title, became one of the most persistent and most symbolically significant features of the Egyptian ideological tradition. The later pharaohs, Ramesses and Nectanebo and Ptolemy and all the others, were still carrying this specific conceptual framework in their royal titularies more than 2,500 years after Den had first used it in its classic form. The specific formulation that Den established, or that was established in the specific context of his reign, was durable enough to outlast every dynasty, every foreign conquest, every civilizational transformation that Egypt experienced in the 3,000 years that followed. The administrative innovations of Den's reign are equally significant but considerably less glamorous. The ivory labels found in his tomb and at other archaeological sites associated with his reign are among the most important primary source documents for understanding the administrative development of the early Egyptian state, not because of what they say individually, each label being a small piece of a larger administrative system, but because of what their accumulation demonstrates about the character of the governance that produced them. The labels record, in the brief and often cryptic hieroglyphic notation of the earliest period of Egyptian writing, information about the goods to which they were attached, the origin of the goods, their quantity, the specific administrative context in which they were being recorded. They are, in effect, the administrative tags of the Egyptian state's earliest systematically organized tax and tribute collection system. The physical evidence of a government that was tracking its incoming resources with enough precision and enough consistency to require a standardized labeling system for every significant quantity of goods entering the royal stores. This standardization is itself the significant thing. A state that produces standardized administrative labels is a state that has developed the specific institutional form of systematic record-keeping. A state in which the collection, recording, and management of resources has been formalized to the degree that it generates its own documentary evidence. The labels from Den's reign are, among other things, evidence that the Egyptian state in the First Dynasty had reached a specific threshold of administrative sophistication, the threshold at which governance becomes systematic rather than personal, at which the institutional infrastructure of the state generates its own documentary record rather than depending entirely on the memory and personal authority of the ruler and his immediate circle. The scholar who has done the most systematic analysis of the administrative documents from Den's reign, the labels, the inscribed vessels, the cylinder seals, is Günther Dreyer of the German Archaeological Institute, whose decades of work at Abydos have produced both the most comprehensive fieldwork and the most rigorous documentary analysis of the early royal cemetery. Dreyer's analysis of the labels from Den's tomb demonstrated, among other things, that Den's administration had developed a specific set of administrative conventions, standard forms for recording quantities, standard designations for categories of goods, standard symbols for administrative offices that represented a significant advance in the formalization of Egyptian state record-keeping relative to the earlier First Dynasty evidence. This advance in administrative formalization was not simply a bureaucratic convenience. It was a foundational contribution to the specific institutional character of the Egyptian state that would sustain the civilization for 3,000 years. A state whose administrative records are formalized, standardized, and systematically maintained is a state whose governance can survive the death of individual rulers and the transition between reigns in ways that states dependent on personal authority cannot. The administrative infrastructure produces institutional continuity. The institutional continuity sustains the state across the specific disruptions and transitions that the passage of time inevitably produces. Den built infrastructure. Not just architectural infrastructure, though the staircase tomb, discussed later in this account, was itself a significant architectural innovation. He built the administrative infrastructure of systematic record-keeping, and the administrative infrastructure he built or significantly advanced was more durable than any physical structure, more durable than the tomb at Abydos, which was looted in antiquity and has survived only as an archaeological deposit, more durable than the mud brick palaces that presumably housed his court and have left no above-ground traces at all. The administrative tradition survived. The specific forms, the labels, the standardized records, the systematic tracking of goods continued in evolving versions for 3,000 years. That durability is Den's most important legacy. Not the double crown, though the double crown is more visible and more symbolically resonant. Not the smiting Pharaoh image, though that image is more dramatically striking. The administrative infrastructure, the systematic, formalized, institutionally grounded approach to managing the resources of the Egyptian state, is the foundation on which everything that came later was built. And it was built, in its early form, by a king who ruled Egypt more than 5,000 years ago, whose name most people alive today have never heard. That silence is what this account is working to break. The specific geographic extent of the Egyptian state that Den governed deserves explicit attention because the scale of the administrative challenge he faced is easy to underestimate if the geography is not clearly in mind. The Nile Valley, from the first cataract in the south to the Mediterranean coast in the north, stretches approximately 1,000 kilometers. This is a river valley, meaning a narrow strip of cultivable land, rarely more than a few kilometers wide, flanked on both sides by desert. The delta, where the Nile fans out across a broad floodplain before reaching the sea, adds a substantial area of additional cultivable territory, but it has different agricultural conditions, different ecological characteristics, and different cultural traditions from the valley to its south. A king who ruled both the valley and the delta, a king who wore the double crown, was ruling a territory of significant geographic and ecological diversity, connected by the Nile but not otherwise homogeneous. The administrative challenge of governing such a territory, maintaining communications across 1,000 kilometers of river, managing the annual flood and the agricultural cycle across the full length of the valley, collecting tribute and taxes from communities distributed along the entire length of the Nile, deploying military force when needed across these distances, was genuinely formidable. The administrative labels from Desen reign are evidence that his government was attempting to meet this challenge systematically. The variety of origins recorded on the labels, goods flowing to the royal stores from different parts of Egypt, different administrative districts, different agricultural contexts, suggests a central administrative apparatus that was genuinely capable of tracking flows of goods across the full geographic extent of the unified state. How well it actually worked, how effectively the First Dynasty state was actually able to govern the full extent of its territory, is a question that the archaeological evidence cannot fully answer. What it can say is that the attempt was being made, that the administrative apparatus being used to make the attempt was becoming progressively more sophisticated during Den's reign, and that the specific forms of that apparatus were the early versions of the institutional framework that would eventually sustain one of the longest-lived civilizations in human history. The foundation was being laid, the scale was being established, the forms were being invented, and Den was among the most important inventors. One more foundational element requires attention before this account can move fully into the specifics of Den's reign and his contributions: the question of writing itself. The hieroglyphic writing system, one of the most visually distinctive and most culturally significant writing systems in human history, was not fully developed when Den came to the throne. It was in the process of development. The earliest hieroglyphic signs appear in the Egyptian archaeological record in the century or so before the First Dynasty's founding, and the specific trajectory of their development across the First Dynasty, becoming progressively more systematic, more standardized, and more capable of recording a wider range of information, is one of the most important stories in the history of human communication. Den's reign sits at a specific and important point in this trajectory. The writing visible on the administrative labels and other objects from his reign is more sophisticated than the writing on the objects from the earlier First Dynasty reigns, but less sophisticated than the writing that would characterize the Old Kingdom. It is the specific moment when the Egyptian writing system was crossing the threshold from a limited administrative notation system into a fully functional language encoding system capable of recording complex information. This specific moment, the moment when writing in Egypt was becoming capable of expressing the full range of human language rather than simply recording quantities and administrative categories, is itself one of the most important developments in the history of human civilization. Writing is the technology that makes institutional memory possible at scale, that allows information to be stored, retrieved, and transmitted across time and space in ways that oral tradition cannot. The development of functional writing in Egypt was the precondition for the specific form of institutional sophistication that the Egyptian state would go on to achieve. Den was ruling Egypt at the moment when this precondition was being established. He was, in the most literal sense, governing at the dawn of recorded Egyptian history, at the moment when the history that came after him became possible to record in the way that it has been recorded. This is the foundation, this is the scale. Now the story moves into its specific details. The specific details of Den's reign are preserved not in the kind of narrative historical accounts that the later periods of Egyptian history produced. There were no Herodotus figures recording oral traditions about First Dynasty kings, no Hebrew prophets commenting on First Dynasty politics, no Babylonian chronicle entries marking First Dynasty military events. The specific details are preserved in the material culture itself, in the tombs and the objects and the inscribed labels that archaeology has recovered from the earth. Reading that material culture, learning to see in an ivory label or a stone vessel the specific institutional and symbolic significance that the people who made it understood it to carry, is the specific art of the archaeologist and the specialist in early Egyptian history. It is a demanding art, and it produces conclusions that are always subject to revision as new material is found and new analytical techniques are applied. This account presents those conclusions in the best available form that the current scholarship provides. Where the evidence is clear, it presents what the evidence shows. Where it is ambiguous, it acknowledges the ambiguity. And where the scholarly consensus is contested, it presents the debate honestly, rather than pretending a certainty that the evidence does not support. The story of Den, told as faithfully as the evidence allows, follows. It is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of ancient civilization. The story of a man who lived at the beginning of everything and who helped to invent some of what came after. The core problem that Den faced, the deepest and most consequential challenge of his reign, was the problem that every ruler of the early Egyptian state faced, amplified by the specific scale of the unified kingdom and the specific character of the institutional framework that was still being assembled around it. The problem was legitimacy. Not legitimacy in the narrow political sense of having the right genealogical credentials or the right military backing to hold a throne. Legitimacy in the deeper sense that all complex societies face. The problem of producing and maintaining the specific shared belief that the person who wields authority over thousands of people, who commands their labor, requires their tribute, deploys their lives in military campaigns, has the right to do so. That this authority is not simply the expression of naked force, which any sufficiently ruthless individual could temporarily achieve, but the expression of something larger and more permanent, something cosmological, something divine, something that connects the specific person holding the throne to the fundamental ordering principles of the universe. This is not simply a theological problem, it is a practical institutional one. A state that can only maintain its authority through continuous coercion is a state that requires enormous ongoing investment in the coercive apparatus, and that is perpetually vulnerable to the moment when the coercive apparatus fails or is overcome. A state that has solved the legitimacy problem, that has persuaded its population at a level deep enough that the persuasion is internalized rather than resisted, can sustain its authority at a fraction of the coercive cost, because the population's own belief in the rightness of the arrangement does much of the enforcement work that force would otherwise have to do. The Egyptian pharaonic tradition, the specific set of beliefs about the king's divine nature, his role as the maintainer of cosmic order, his embodiment of Horus, and his connection to Ra and Osiris, was the most successful solution to the legitimacy problem that the ancient world produced. For 3,000 years, the pharaonic ideology sustained the authority of the Egyptian state with a consistency and a depth that no comparable ancient state achieved. The pharaoh was not simply powerful, the pharaoh was divine. The maintenance of the pharaoh's divine rule was not simply politically convenient, it was cosmologically necessary. To challenge it was not simply political opposition, it was chaos, the specific literal chaos that the Egyptian theological tradition called Isfet, the antithesis of the divine order, the force against which the king's authority was constantly arrayed. But this ideology did not arrive fully formed at the beginning of Egyptian history. It was developed, it was worked out by specific people in specific circumstances across the first centuries of unified Egyptian rule, and it was worked out under conditions of genuine uncertainty, conditions in which the specific forms that the ideology would take were not yet determined, in which the specific symbolic vocabulary had not yet been established, in which the institutional practices that would express the ideology in concrete, daily, life-organizing ways were still being invented. Den was one of the specific people who did the specific work of working this out. The double crown was one of his tools. The smiting pharaoh image was another. The administrative labels that bore the royal Horus name and connected the king's authority to every transaction in his kingdom's economy were a third. The tomb at Abydos, the architectural statement of royal power over death itself, the demonstration that the king's authority extended into the afterlife, the institution of human sacrifice that surrounded the royal dead with retainers who would serve them through eternity, was a fourth. Each of these specific elements was a partial answer to the legitimacy problem. Each said, in a different register and to a different audience, something about why the king's authority was legitimate, why it was something more and something different from the authority of any other man with enough force at his disposal to extract tribute from a population. The double crown said, "This ruler holds both lands. He is not the king of a region or a faction. He is the king of the unified whole. the man whose authority encompasses the full diversity of the Egyptian world. The smiting Pharaoh image said, "This ruler is the embodiment of divine violence against chaos. He stands between the ordered world and the forces that would dissolve it. His military campaigns against the enemies of Egypt are not simply territorial expansion or resource extraction. They are the maintenance of cosmic order against the ever-present threat of its disruption." The administrative labels said, "This ruler's authority extends into every transaction, every transfer of goods, every allocation of resources within the kingdom. The goods that flow through the royal economy bear his name. The administrative apparatus that manages those flows is his apparatus, an extension of his authority into the daily economic life of the state." The tomb at Abydos said, "This ruler's authority transcends death. He dies, but he does not simply cease. He passes through death into a divine afterlife in which his authority continues, in which the people who served him in life continue to serve him in death, in which the specific resources needed to sustain him eternally are provided by the living state in recognition of the ongoing cosmological service that the divine king performs even in death." Taken together, these elements were the beginning of a systematic answer to the legitimacy problem that the Egyptian state would continue to elaborate and refine for 3,000 years. Den was not the only person working on this answer. The specific elements were developed in collaboration with the priests and the court officials and the craftsmen who produced the symbolic objects and who designed the administrative procedures. But he was the king in whose reign several of the most important elements were either introduced or significantly advanced. Understanding why this specific moment. The reign of Den in the early First Dynasty, approximately 5,000 years ago, was the moment when these specific answers to the legitimacy problem were developed. Requires understanding what the alternatives were and why the Egyptian solution was extraordinary. The alternative solutions to the legitimacy problem that other early states developed. The Mesopotamian tradition, the early Chinese tradition, the Indus Valley tradition were each genuine solutions with their own specific character. But none of them produced the specific combination of divine kingship ideology, administrative systematization, and symbolic elaboration that the Egyptian tradition developed in its earliest phase. The Egyptian solution was unique in its specific form, and its uniqueness is at least partially a product of the specific geographic, ecological, and historical conditions of the Nile Valley. The Nile Valley's geography created a specific kind of society, a long, narrow strip of fertile land dependent on an annual flood cycle that was powerful enough to transform the land, but predictable enough to be managed, flanked by desert that both protect the valley from easy external invasion and created a specific kind of resource dependency. The valley needed the flood to sustain itself, and the flood's reliability was experienced as a gift that required explanation and gratitude. The specific Egyptian theological tradition, the specific way in which the annual flood, the agricultural cycle, the rising and setting of the sun, the movement of the stars were all interpreted as expressions of a divine order maintained by the king's ritual performance, was shaped by this specific geography. The king who maintained Ma'at, the divine order, was not simply a political ruler. He was the specific ritual specialist, whose daily performance of the correct ceremonies kept the flood coming, kept the crops growing, kept the cosmic machinery of the universe in the specific configuration that sustained human life in the valley. This was not simply metaphor. It was, for the people who believed it, literal cosmological fact. Den was performing this function. He was governing, managing the administrative apparatus, conducting military campaigns, receiving tribute, but he was also performing. The elaborate rituals, the symbolic regalia, the specific ceremonies that the early Egyptian court maintained were the practical expressions of the belief that the king's ritual performance was cosmologically necessary. And the specific administrative and symbolic innovations of his reign were both practical governance tools and contributions to the developing ritual ideological system within which that governance made cosmic sense. The core problem was legitimacy. The solution Den was building was the pharaonic ideology in its early form. The solution proved extraordinarily durable, and the durability was, in significant part, a consequence of the specific character of the solution, the specific way in which it integrated the practical and the cosmological, the administrative and the ritual, the earthly governance and the divine maintenance, into a single coherent system that each element reinforced. That integration is the deepest thing to understand about Den and about the First Dynasty. It is the insight that transforms what might otherwise appear to be a collection of archaeological details, ivory labels, stone vessels, a staircase tomb, into a coherent story about the invention of one of the most durable solutions to the problem of political legitimacy in the history of human civilization. The integration is the story, the details are its evidence, and the details, examined carefully in the sections that follow, reveal the integration with a clarity that the broad outlines alone cannot provide. But here is the problem with the problem, and it gets stranger the closer you look at it. The legitimacy solution that Den and his predecessors and successors were developing, the pharaonic ideology, required for its full expression a form of royal power that went beyond what most states in human history have attempted to claim. The pharaoh was not simply divinely appointed, the pharaoh was divine. Not a man chosen by a god, but a god in human form, performing his earthly function before eventually passing back into the divine sphere through the ceremony of royal death and burial. This claim, the claim of divine kingship in its strongest form, required specific institutional expressions if it was to be maintained convincingly. The tomb was the most important of these. A god who died had to die in a way that confirmed rather than challenged his divine nature. The elaborate architecture of Den's tomb, the extraordinary quantity of grave goods, the retinue of sacrificed retainers who accompanied him in death. These were the institutional expressions of the belief that the king's death was not simply biological termination, but cosmological transformation. The scale of the retainer sacrifice in the First Dynasty, the number of people killed and buried alongside the royal dead, was itself one of the most extraordinary and most disturbing features of the early pharaonic tradition. Den's tomb was surrounded by the graves of approximately 137 subsidiary burials, servants, officials, craftsmen, women of the royal court who were killed at the time of his death to accompany him into the afterlife. This practice was not unique to Den. It was characteristic of the First Dynasty as a whole, and the numbers of retainer burials varied across different reigns. What it says about the specific character of the early pharaonic ideology is important. The king's death was understood to be of such cosmological significance that it required the deaths of those around him to accompany and sustain him in the afterlife. His divine importance was so overwhelming that it dissolved the usual human obligations to the people who served him, that it made their continued service in death not simply a cultural preference, but a cosmic necessity. The practice was abandoned in the Second Dynasty and later periods. It was one of the elements of the early pharaonic tradition that did not survive into the mature Egyptian state, but its presence in the First Dynasty, its scale, its systematic character, its apparent acceptance, tells us something important about the specific nature of the legitimacy solution being worked out in Den's time, that the early Egyptian state was willing to push the logic of divine kingship to its most extreme institutional expression, and that the abandonment of that extreme expression was itself a later refinement that the tradition could accommodate without abandoning the underlying ideology. The core problem was solved, but the first solution to it was not perfect. The refinements came later. Den was the ruler in whose reign the first systematic version of the solution was being worked out. That working out is the most important thing his reign accomplished, and the following sections examine it in the detail it deserves. The specific working out that Den's reign contributed requires closer examination of the specific objects that the archaeological record has preserved from this period. Objects whose symbolic content and whose administrative function tell a story about the development of the pharaonic ideology that the broad outlines alone cannot convey. The most famous single object from Den's reign is the ivory label found at Abydos that depicts the king smiting an enemy. The label is small, a few centimeters on each side, a tab of carved ivory that would have been attached by a cord to a specific container or object as an administrative identifier. But the image carved on it is one of the most significant in the history of Egyptian iconography. A king, identifiable by his specific regalia, raising a mace above his head to strike a kneeling, bound captive. This image, the smiting pharaoh, became one of the most persistent and most symbolically charged images in the entire 3,000-year history of Egyptian art. It appears on the Nama palette, the monumental carved slate that is perhaps the most famous surviving object from the period of Egyptian unification, and that is often interpreted as recording the specific act of unification itself. It appears on temple walls across Egypt for the next 3,000 years. Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, wherever pharaohs chose to depict themselves as the embodiment of divine violence against chaos. It became the defining image of pharaonic power over foreigners, over enemies, over the forces of disorder that perpetually threatened the divine order. The specific Den label is important because it represents one of the earliest, possibly the earliest, standardized use of this image on an administrative object. Previous smiting images existed, but the appearance of the image on an administrative label on the specific kind of object that was being systematically produced and used across the administrative apparatus of the early Egyptian state suggests that by Den's reign, the image had become an official visual element of the pharaonic identity, deployed not just in monumental contexts, but in the everyday administrative currency of the kingdom. The inscription on the label, imperfectly understood, but apparently referring to a military action against the people of the Eastern Desert, possibly Sinai or the region beyond, connects the image to a specific historical event rather than simply a symbolic statement. Den was apparently conducting actual military campaigns, and the imagery of the smiting pharaoh was being used to record and symbolically frame those campaigns in the specific administrative records of the state. This combination, military action recorded in administrative documents using the specific symbolic vocabulary of divine royal violence, is itself a significant institutional development. It says that the administrative apparatus of the Egyptian state was not simply recording commercial transactions, but was encoding the specific ideological content of the pharaonic tradition into its everyday documentation. The administrative records were not politically neutral tracking devices. They were ideological statements, expressing and reinforcing the specific beliefs about royal authority that the legitimacy solution required. The scholar Catherine Bard, whose handbook on Egyptian archaeology is one of the most widely used comprehensive references in the field, described the Den smiting label as one of the most important single objects for understanding the development of pharaonic iconography, precisely because of this administrative context. The image's appearance on a label, rather than simply on a monumental object where its ideological intent would be explicit, demonstrates that the pharaonic ideology had, by Den's reign, penetrated the administrative fabric of the state deeply enough to shape the design of its most routine documentation. This penetration of ideology into administration is, in retrospect, one of the most important features of the Egyptian state's longevity, an ideology that is expressed only in monumental contexts, in temples and palaces that the ordinary population encounters infrequently, maintains a different kind of presence in the culture than an ideology that is expressed in the administrative objects that circulate through the everyday economic life of the society. The labels that bore the royal name, the seal impressions that marked goods as part of the royal economy, the administrative categories that organized the state's tracking of resources, all of these were expressions of the pharaonic ideology in the ordinary, everyday, unavoidable context of economic life. This is not accidental. It is the specific institutional expression of a governing intelligence that understood, or was developing the understanding, that effective governance requires not just the maintenance of the legitimacy narrative in the grand symbolic registers of temple and tomb, but its expression in every dimension of the organized life that the state both produced and depended on. Den's administration was building this integrated expression. The labels are the most direct surviving evidence, but the labels are the tip of an administrative iceberg that the total archaeological record from his reign only partially reveals. The question of the retainer sacrifice returns here, because it is one of the most persistently puzzling aspects of the First Dynasty evidence. Understanding why it happened, why the early Egyptian state, in the process of developing the specific institutional solutions to the legitimacy problem, included the systematic killing of servants as part of the royal funerary ritual, requires understanding the specific character of the early pharaonic ideology in its most extreme form. The logic of the retainer sacrifice was the logic of the divine king's continuing need for service. If the king was divine, if his death was a cosmological transformation rather than simply biological termination, if his authority and his function continued in the divine sphere, then the people who had served him in life should continue to serve him in the afterlife. The specific concern was continuity of service, the worry that the king's divine functioning would be disrupted if the servants who maintained his earthly life were not available to maintain his divine life. This logic is internally consistent within the specific framework of the early pharaonic ideology. It is also extraordinarily demanding. It requires the deaths of potentially hundreds of people as an expression of a single ruler's cosmological significance, and its eventual abandonment in the Second Dynasty and later periods represents the development of an alternative solution to the problem of providing for the king's continuing needs in the afterlife. The model offering, the substitute image, the inscribed formula that could provide magically what physical service provided actually. The transition from actual retainer sacrifice to symbolic substitute is one of the most significant developments in the history of Egyptian ritual and ideology, and it happened across the period immediately following Den's reign. The First Dynasty and Den's reign, with its approximately 137 subsidiary burials, represents the height of the literal practice. The Second Dynasty saw its decline and eventual abandonment. Understanding why the transition happened is genuinely uncertain. Was it simply the unsustainability of the practice? The practical difficulty of killing large numbers of skilled servants at every royal death, the loss of trained personnel and institutional knowledge that accompanied each round of royal funerary sacrifice? Was it ideological development, the recognition that the same theological purpose could be served by symbolic substitutes that did not require actual deaths? Was it political, a response to resistance from the court, officials, and servants who understood themselves as potential victims of the royal funerary tradition? The evidence does not allow a definitive answer. What it does allow is the recognition that the transition represents a genuine ideological development, the recognition that the physical and the symbolic could achieve the same ritual effect, and that the symbolic solution was preferable to the physical one. This is itself a significant intellectual development. The abstraction of ritual from its most literal expression to a symbolic substitute. And it is one of the intellectual achievements of the early Egyptian state that deserves recognition as such. Den lived and ruled in the period before this development had fully occurred. His tomb was surrounded by the graves of more than 100 people who died so that their king's cosmic functioning could be sustained. This fact must be held alongside the administrative sophistication, the symbolic innovations, and the institutional contributions that his reign produced. The story of Den is not simply a story of civilizational achievement. It is also the story of a specific institution, the retainer sacrifice, that represented the extreme expression of a legitimacy ideology, whose subsequent refinements would gradually moderate without abandoning the core commitment. The achievement and the cost were both real. Both deserve their honest accounting. And here is what makes this truly sobering when you look at the full scope of the evidence. The people buried in the subsidiary graves around Den's tomb were not randomly selected. The archaeological analysis of their graves suggests that they were specifically associated with the court, officials, servants, craftsmen who had performed specific functions in the royal household. They were people who had been close to the king, who had known him, who had served him in the specific ways that the administrative and ritual life of the early Egyptian court required. Their deaths were not the deaths of strangers. They were the deaths of people who had organized their lives around the service of the royal household and who died as the ultimate expression of that service. The ideology that framed their deaths as cosmologically necessary was an ideology that they had presumably been raised within and had contributed to maintaining. The specific horror of this, the way in which an ideological system can make the deaths of its own most committed participants appear not simply acceptable but required, is one of the more disturbing features of the early pharaonic tradition. It is also one of the most instructive. The pharaonic ideology, from its earliest form, required enormous human investment, in labor, in resources, and ultimately in life, to maintain. The durability of that ideology across 3,000 years was not the durability of something cheap or easy. It was the durability of something into which the Egyptian civilization had invested, generation after generation, the most intensive efforts that its institutional and material resources could sustain. That investment is what the Abydos cemetery ultimately represents. The tombs are not simply the burial places of early kings. They are the physical evidence of the sustained investment of a civilization in the specific legitimacy, ideology, that was the foundation of its governance. Den's tomb is the most elaborate of the First Dynasty royal tombs, and what that elaboration represents is nothing less than the high watermark of the early Egyptian civilization's investment in the specific solution to the legitimacy problem that the pharaonic tradition had developed. The subsequent sections examine that tomb and the other elements of Den's reign in the specific detail that the full account requires. The problem of governance at the dawn of civilization is a problem that deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms, not simply as the primitive antecedent of more sophisticated later solutions, but as a genuine and demanding intellectual and institutional challenge faced by specific human beings in specific historical circumstances. The rulers of the First Dynasty were not simply powerful men expressing their dominance over populations that they could coerce. They were people grappling with questions that had no established answers. Questions about how to organize the governance of a large, diverse territory, about how to maintain the authority of a central power over distant communities, about how to persuade people that the tribute and labor they contributed to the royal economy was not simply extraction but participation in something cosmologically significant, about how to create the institutional forms that would allow authority to be transferred, maintained, and renewed across the inevitable transitions of death and succession. These are difficult questions. They have not been solved once and for all in any civilization or any era. They arise, in different forms and different contexts, whenever a complex society faces the challenge of maintaining organized authority over a large population. The specific solutions that the First Dynasty worked out, the pharaonic ideology, the administrative infrastructure, the symbolic vocabulary of divine kingship, were extraordinarily successful solutions to these questions in the specific conditions of the Nile Valley for an extraordinarily long time. Den was one of the people who worked out those solutions. He deserves to be understood as such. The following sections examine the specific evidence for his contributions: the tomb, the labels, the administrative innovations, the symbolic precedents, in the detail that the understanding of those contributions requires. The evidence is complex and sometimes ambiguous. The scholarly debates about it are genuine and unresolved in several important respects. And the story it tells, when assembled carefully and read honestly, is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of human civilization. The story of the invention of an ideological system that would sustain a civilization for 3,000 years, worked out in the desert cemetery of a man who died more than 5,000 years ago. That story begins in the tomb. The tomb is the place where the legitimacy ideology reached its most complete and most costly expression. It is also the place where the archaeological evidence for Den's reign is most concentrated and most revealing. The story of the tomb, its construction, its contents, its architectural innovations, its relationship to the tombs that preceded and followed it, is the story of Den in his most fully visible form. It begins now, in the following section, in the details that the archaeology has preserved. 5,000 years after the doors of that tomb were closed, the earth gave it back. What the earth preserved is what this account now examines. The problem was legitimacy. The solution was the Pharaoh. The evidence is in the ground at Abydos, and the evidence, read carefully, reveals one of the most extraordinary human beings who ever governed on the banks of the Nile. The Pharaoh who first wore the double crown. The Pharaoh who surrounded himself in death with the people who had served him in life. The Pharaoh whose administrative labels still bear his name. 5,000 years after the scribes who wrote them were dust. His name was Den, and his story, in its fullest available form, is the story that follows. The story that follows is assembled from the fragments that survive. The fragmentation is unavoidable. 5,000 years of time have done their specific work on the physical evidence, and the written record of the first dynasty is thin in ways that the later periods of Egyptian history are not. But the fragments are extraordinary in their own right, and assembled carefully, in the light of the best available scholarly analysis, they produce a picture of a specific ruler, a specific reign, and a specific civilizational moment that deserves the attention it has too seldom received. The core problem was legitimacy. The solution was the Pharaoh. The evidence is Den. Now, let us see him as clearly as the evidence allows. The exploration begins. The exploration will take us into the tomb at Abydos, through the administrative records of a 5,000-year-old bureaucracy, across the symbolic vocabulary of a civilization still finding its language, and back out to the larger questions about what Den's specific contributions meant for the civilization that came after him. It will take us, along the way, through the most recent archaeological discoveries that have continued to reshape the scholarly understanding of this extraordinary period. Discoveries that are, in several cases, still ongoing. This is the edge of written history. This is where the story begins. And at the edge of written history, Den was there, governing, building, killing, innovating, performing the specific rituals that he believed sustained the cosmic order. Whether those beliefs were true in any literal sense is a question that the evidence cannot answer, and that this account does not attempt to answer. What is true is that those beliefs produced, in the specific conditions of the first dynasty, a civilization of extraordinary durability and extraordinary achievement. Den helped build it. The story of how is what comes next. The how is in the details. The details are in the archaeology. The archaeology is at Abydos, and it has been yielding its secrets for more than a century and continues to yield them now. What those secrets say about Den, and about the civilization he helped to create, is the subject of the chapters that follow. The chapters begin now with the man who excavated the tomb that reveals Den most fully, and with what he found when the earth finally gave it up. 5,000 years of desert silence, 120 years of archaeology, and a story that has been waiting in the ground at Abydos since before the pyramids were built. Now, the ground opens. The exploration of Den. The first pharaoh to wear the double crown, the most administratively sophisticated ruler of the first dynasty, the king whose tomb was the largest and most complex structure of his era, begins in the next section with the full archaeological and historical detail that the evidence allows. The core problem has been named. The context has been established. Now the story opens to its full complexity. Full complexity now. The full complexity begins with the staircase. The staircase was Den's architectural invention, and it was, in the specific moment of the first dynasty, a revolutionary one. Chapter 1. The staircase tomb. The staircase was Den's architectural invention, and it was, in the specific moment of the first dynasty, a revolutionary one. The earlier first dynasty royal tombs at Abydos, the tombs of Nama, Aha, Jer, and Jet, were pit tombs. Substantial pit tombs, lined with mud brick, divided into chambers, covered with wooden roofing, and eventually filled in, but pit tombs nonetheless. To enter them, you descended into an excavated pit that had been dug from the surface and then sealed at the completion of the burial. Once sealed, there was no way back in without excavating. Den's tomb had a staircase. The staircase descended from the desert surface down into the burial chamber. A long, straight staircase of cut stone steps leading from the level of the surrounding desert down into the heart of the royal tomb. It allowed access to the burial chamber during the construction and fitting out of the tomb, and it allowed the king's body to be brought in through the entrance at the top rather than lowered from above. It also, and this is the element that has generated the most scholarly discussion, allowed goods to be brought into the tomb even after the initial burial sealing, perhaps as part of a continuing mortuary cult that maintained the tomb's ritual functioning across the period following the king's death. The architectural innovation of the staircase had consequences that went beyond the immediate practical convenience of the construction process. It transformed the relationship between the living and the dead in the physical space of the tomb. The pit tomb was architecturally sealed. After burial, it was finished, closed, a past tense. The staircase tomb maintained an architectural connection between the world of the living and the world of the dead, a physical pathway between the two that expressed in architectural form the specific understanding of royal death that the pharaonic ideology was developing, that the king's death was not a termination, but a transformation, that the connection between the living king and the divine royal dead continued through ritual maintenance, that the tomb was not simply a sealed container, but a functioning ritual space. This is, in retrospect, a foundational architectural idea of Egyptian civilization. The pyramids, the most architecturally elaborate royal tombs in the subsequent history of Egyptian civilization, were not simply large piles of stone. They were functional ritual spaces whose internal architecture expressed specific ideas about the king's journey through death. The staircase tomb of Den, modest by comparison with the later pyramids, but sophisticated for its specific moment, was an early expression of the same underlying principle, the royal tomb, as an architectural statement about the nature of royal death and the continuing relationship between the living and the divine dead. Gunter Dreyer's excavations at the Abydos Royal Cemetery, which have continued with periodic interruptions from the 1980s of the modern era through the first decades of the 21st century, have produced the most detailed current understanding of Den's tomb and its architectural character. Dreyer's work revealed that Den's tomb, designated Tomb T in the scholarly literature, was not only larger than any previous royal tomb at Abydos, but was equipped with a granite floor in the burial chamber itself, the first known use of granite in Egyptian architecture. Granite, not mud brick, the standard building material of the period, not limestone, which was more accessible than granite. Granite, a hard, difficult stone that had to be quarried in the Aswan region, hundreds of kilometers to the south, and transported on the Nile to Abydos. The logistics of obtaining granite for the burial chamber floor of Den's tomb were, in the administrative conditions of the early First Dynasty, a genuinely impressive organizational achievement. Why granite? The specific choice of material deserves attention. Granite is not simply harder than limestone or more durable than mud brick. In the later Egyptian tradition, granite carried specific symbolic associations. It was the stone of divine permanence, the material associated with the most sacred and the most eternal architectural contexts. The granite sarcophagi of later pharaohs, the granite obelisks, the granite facing of the most important temple chambers. All of these drew on the specific symbolic weight that granite carried in the Egyptian tradition. Den's tomb floor was, by the available evidence, the first systematic use of granite in an Egyptian monumental context. It was, in the symbolic vocabulary that was developing, a statement about the permanence and the divine character of the space it was used in. And it was, in the practical context of the administrative challenges it required, a demonstration of the organizational capacity of Den's administration, the ability to mobilize the quarrying, transport, and working of a difficult stone from a distant source, on a scale that the later tradition would remember as the beginning of what became one of Egypt's most characteristic material achievements. Chapter 2. Petrie at the Royal Cemetery. In 1899 CE, Flinders Petrie stood at the edge of the Abydos Royal Cemetery and began the systematic excavation that would, over the following years, transform the scholarly understanding of early Egyptian history. The story of that excavation, the specific discoveries it produced, the specific challenges it faced, and the specific scholarly consequences it had, is one of the great stories of 19th and early 20th century archaeology. Petrie had come to Abydos specifically to redo, or at least to salvage, the work of Amélinot. The French archaeologist had been excavating the royal cemetery since 1895, with methods that Petrie found professionally appalling. Objects removed from their contexts, stratigraphic relationships destroyed, the specific archaeological information that context and position provide simply discarded in the pursuit of individual interesting objects. Petrie was determined to recover what could still be recovered, and to do it properly. His methods were the methods he had been developing and refining across 2 decades of fieldwork. Systematic recording of every find and its position, careful attention to the stratigraphic relationships between layers, the sieving, and careful examination of debris for small objects that a less meticulous approach would miss. These methods, standard practice in modern archaeology, revolutionary in the context of 19th century Egyptology, produced results that transformed the scholarly understanding of the period. What Petrie found at Abydos was material that pushed the origins of Egyptian civilization significantly further back than the existing scholarly consensus had assumed. The objects from the royal tombs, the ivory labels, the stone vessels, the pottery, the carved ivory and ebony implements, were not crude or simple. They were the products of sophisticated craft traditions, of organized production, of a level of material culture that implied considerable organizational complexity behind it. The specific moment in Petrie's excavation that most directly illuminated the story of Den was the recovery of the royal tomb and the objects associated with it. The tomb itself had been substantially disturbed by Amélinot's work and by earlier looting. The First Dynasty royal tombs had been robbed in antiquity and had been further disturbed by the medieval construction of a Coptic monastery on the same site. But enough remained, in the disturbed fill and in the portions of the tomb that had escaped the worst of the looting, to allow Petrie to recognize the tomb's scale and to recover significant quantities of objects that had been scattered through the fill. The ivory label showing the king smiting a foreign enemy was among the objects recovered from the debris associated with Den's tomb. Petrie recognized its significance immediately. The image, the specific combination of a king in royal regalia, a foreign captive, and a mace raised to strike, was not new to Petrie. He had seen it in later Egyptian monumental art. But seeing it here, in the First Dynasty material, in a context that predated the classic monumental smiting scenes by centuries, was a specific demonstration of how far back the pharaonic ideological tradition extended. The labels, the stone vessels, the seal impressions, each category of object told a specific part of the story. Together, they told the story of an administrative system of genuine sophistication, operating in the context of a royal ideology that was already developing the specific symbolic vocabulary that would characterize Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years. Petrie's publication of the Abydos material, in a series of reports issued in the early 1900s, was received by the scholarly community with the specific excitement of people encountering evidence that fundamentally revised their understanding of the past. The reviews were not simply appreciative, they were astonished. The evidence that Petrie was presenting demonstrated that Egyptian civilization in its first dynasty had been more sophisticated, more organizationally capable, and more symbolically developed than the existing scholarly framework had accounted for. Chapter 3. The administrative labels. The ivory and ebony labels from Den's tomb are among the most important documentary sources for the administrative history of the First Dynasty, and they deserve the specific attention that their scholarly significance commands. A label is, in physical terms, a small rectangular tab of ivory or ebony, typically a few centimeters on each side, with a hole at one end through which a cord could be passed. The cord attached the label to a container, a bundle of goods, or another object, identifying the object for administrative purposes. The inscription on the label, incised with the sharp point of a tool into the hard surface of the ivory or ebony, recorded, in the early hieroglyphic script of the period, information about the object it was attached to. The information recorded on the labels varied in its specific character, but the most common elements were a number indicating the quantity of the goods, an indication of their origin or the occasion, that produced them, the name of the official responsible for the transaction, and sometimes a reference to the specific administrative context, the specific year of the king's reign, a specific festival, a specific royal event within which the goods were being transferred. This combination of information, quantity, origin, official context, is the basic information structure of an administrative tracking system. It is the information you need to record if you want to know where things came from, how much there was, who was responsible for them, and when the transaction occurred. It is, in other words, the information that a functional administrative system needs to maintain accountability and to allow the reconstruction of the history of specific goods and specific transactions. The labels from Den's reign are more numerous than those from any previous First Dynasty reign. They are also, by the scholarly consensus, more standardized in their format, more consistent in the specific information categories they record and in the way they record them. This greater standardization is itself evidence of administrative development. The standardization of record-keeping formats across a large administrative system requires a degree of organizational coherence, a common set of conventions shared among the officials who produce the records that reflects genuine institutional development. The specific content of some of Den's labels is particularly revealing. Several of the labels record what appears to be an administrative restructuring, the reorganization of the Egyptian state's territory into specific administrative units for the purposes of census-taking and resource management. The specific nature of this reorganization is debated among specialists, but the scholarly consensus is that Den's reign saw the introduction or the significant formalization of the nome system, the division of Egypt into specific administrative districts, each with its own designated official and its own organizational identity, that remained the basic administrative geography of Egypt for the next 3,000 years. If this attribution is correct, and the label evidence is genuinely compelling, though not beyond scholarly debate, Den's administrative contribution was even more fundamental than the development of standardized record-keeping. He was the ruler under whom the geographic infrastructure of the Egyptian administrative state was established in a form that his successors would maintain essentially intact for 3 millennia. The nome system was not simply a convenient administrative division. It was the physical expression of the pharaonic understanding of the relationship between the king and the land. The understanding that the land of Egypt was specifically organized in relation to the king's authority, that every part of the country had a defined relationship to the central power, that the king's governance was not simply the exercise of power over an undifferentiated territory, but the management of a specifically organized landscape of administrative units, each with its own character and its own obligations. This spatial organization of governance is itself a significant conceptual achievement. Not all early states develop it. Those that do tend to be more administratively durable than those that do not, because the spatial organization of governance allows the administrative system to function with less dependence on the specific personal relationships between the central authority and the local communities, and more dependence on the formal structures, the nome boundaries, the nome officials, the specific administrative conventions that persist across changes of individual personnel. Den apparently developed or significantly formalized this spatial organization of the Egyptian state. The nome system he established survived him by 3,000 years. This is as close to a purely institutional immortality as any ruler in the history of the ancient world achieved. Chapter 4. The Horus name Egyptian kings had multiple names. The full pharaonic titulary eventually included 5 separate names, each expressing a different aspect of the king's divine nature and royal identity. The oldest of these names, and the one that was used from the very beginning of the First Dynasty, was the Horus name, the name that identified the king as the living manifestation of the god Horus, the sky god whose specific association with the king was one of the most fundamental features of the Egyptian royal ideology. The Horus name was written inside a specific symbol called the serek, a rectangular enclosure that represented the facade of the royal palace. topped by the image of a falcon representing Horus. The king's name inside the Serek was literally the name of the divine king who resided in the palace, the living Horus, the divine ruler of Egypt. Den's Horus name was Den, a name that may mean the one who strikes or the one who acts, though the precise etymology and meaning are disputed among specialists. The name appears on the labels, the seal impressions, and the other administrative objects associated with his reign, written in the Serek enclosure in the early hieroglyphic notation of the period. The significance of the Horus name in the context of Den's reign is not simply philological. The association of the king with Horus, with the specific mythological figure who was the son of Osiris and the avenger of his father's murder, who was the legitimate heir of the divine kingship, was one of the central theological claims of the pharaonic ideology. The king was Horus, not symbolically, not metaphorically, not in the weak sense of a mere honorific, literally, theologically, in the specific sense that the pharaonic tradition insisted on. The living king was the current embodiment of the eternal divine kingship that Horus represented. This claim made through the specific visual vocabulary of the Serek, through the specific use of the Horus name in administrative documents, through the specific rituals that the court maintained, was the theological foundation of the legitimacy ideology. And Den's administration was deploying this claim systematically in the everyday administrative documentation of the state. Every label that bore the Horus name Den was a small piece of the ideological apparatus that maintained the claim across the daily transactions of the Egyptian economy. The Serek itself, as a visual symbol, as an administrative convention, as an architectural reference, was a specifically royal device. Its presence on administrative documents was the physical expression of the king's presence in every transaction. The label with the smiting image was a dramatic individual statement, but the Serek on every label was the systematic, pervasive, unavoidable presence of the royal ideological claim in the administrative fabric of the state. Den's reign apparently saw the introduction of one of the most important additions to the Horus name tradition, the use of the Ensut Biti title, the King of Upper and Lower Egypt designation, as a formal component of the royal titulary. This title, which became one of the most fundamental elements of the five-name pharaonic titulary, expressed in its very formulation the dual character of the Egyptian kingdom and the king's specific role as the ruler of the unified whole. The Ensut Biti title does not appear in the earlier First Dynasty evidence with the systematic consistency it shows in Den's reign. Its appearance and formalization during his reign was the specific moment at which the dual character of Egyptian kingship was institutionalized in the official titulary. The specific moment at which King of Upper and Lower Egypt became not just a descriptive statement, but a formal title, a permanent component of the king's official identity. Chapter 5. Merneith and the question of women's power. Den was apparently not the son of the previous king, Jet. The succession from Jet to Den involved an intermediate figure, Merneith, who has been one of the most discussed and most debated figures in the entire history of First Dynasty scholarship. Merneith appears in the Abydos material as the owner of a substantial royal tomb, a tomb of comparable scale and elaboration to the tombs of the male First Dynasty rulers, equipped with its own retainer burials, located within the royal cemetery at Abydos, alongside the tombs of the kings. She also appears on administrative documents from Den's reign in a context that suggests she held a significant formal position in relation to the king. The scholarly consensus, based on the accumulated analysis of the evidence, is that Merneith was Den's mother and that she served as regent during the early years of his reign, possibly because he came to the throne as a child, requiring a regent to exercise royal authority until he was old enough to govern personally. This interpretation would make Merneith one of the earliest female rulers, or co-rulers, in the history of Egypt, and one of the earliest women in recorded history to hold the effective authority of the state. The specific evidence for this interpretation is the combination of Merneith's royal tomb, which implies a royal or near-royal status, and the specific character of her name's appearance in administrative documents alongside Den's Horus name, in a way that suggests a formal official relationship, rather than simply a personal or familial one. Whether Merneith actually wore a crown performed royal rituals, or held formal royal titles in her own right is a question that the evidence does not fully resolve. The later Egyptian tradition of female kingship, most famously represented by Hatshepsut in the New Kingdom, may trace its precedent back to Mernith, but the evidence for the First Dynasty is too fragmentary to allow confidence about the specific nature of her authority. What is clear is that Mernith was a woman of extraordinary institutional importance in the first decades of Egyptian recorded history. Her tomb at Abydos, discovered by Petrie, further excavated by Dreyer, was built with the same investment of resources and the same elaboration of funerary ritual that the tombs of the male First Dynasty kings received. Whatever the specific nature of her authority, it was authority significant enough to be marked with the same institutional expressions of royal power that the kings employed. The story of Mernith is the story of a woman who held real power at the dawn of one of the most important civilizations in human history, and whose specific story has been largely lost to the silence of a record too fragmentary to fully reconstruct. It is one of the more poignant silences in the history of the ancient world, and it is the specific context within which the story of Den's accession and early reign must be understood. Chapter 6, the cemetery at Saqqara and the question of Memphis, the royal cemetery at Abydos, was not the only significant burial ground of the First Dynasty. At Saqqara, the desert plateau on the west bank of the Nile that would later become the site of the Step Pyramid of Djoser and many of the most important Old Kingdom monuments, there is another cemetery of large First Dynasty tombs that was excavated in the 1930s of the modern era by the Egyptian archaeologist Zaki Saad. The Saqqara tombs are, by some measures, even more elaborate than the Abydos tombs. They are larger. They have a specific architectural feature, a stepped superstructure known as a mastaba, that represents a different approach to the architectural expression of royal power than the Abydos tombs, and they were clearly built with enormous resources by people of very high status. For decades, the scholarly debate about the Saqqara tombs centered on a specific question: were they the actual royal tombs? Were the First Dynasty kings actually buried at Saqqara, in the elaborate mastaba tombs that were closer to the administrative capital at Memphis, with the Abydos tombs serving as cenotaphs, symbolic tombs built at the sacred ancestral location, but not the actual burial places of the kings? This debate, one of the most productive scholarly disputes in the history of Egyptology, was substantially resolved by the work of Werner Kaiser in the 1950s and 60s, who demonstrated through systematic analysis of the administrative evidence that the Abydos tombs were the actual royal burials and that the Saqqara mastabas were the tombs of high officials, men of the royal court who built tombs of comparable elaboration to demonstrate their own status, and whose tombs clustered around the royal capital at Memphis as the administrative center of the kingdom. The resolution of this debate was itself significant for understanding Den and the First Dynasty more broadly. It established that the Egyptian state's royal tradition was specifically and deliberately tied to Abydos, to the southern ancestral location, even as the administrative capital moved north toward Memphis and the Delta. The kings of the First Dynasty chose, generation after generation, to be buried at the distant southern site rather than at the more convenient northern location. This choice was a deliberate statement about the specific character of the Egyptian royal tradition, its roots in the south, its connection to the ancestral burial ground, its maintenance of the specific link to the pre-dynastic origins of the unified kingdom. For Den, this meant a tomb at Abydos, despite the administrative center of his kingdom being hundreds of kilometers to the north. It meant the logistical challenge and the resource investment of constructing a major tomb at a distant location. And it meant the specific ideological statement of placing his eternal resting place in the same cemetery as the kings who had come before him and the kings who would come after, the physical expression of the royal continuity that the pharaonic ideology required. The staircase, the granite floor, the retainer graves, the administrative labels, all of these were features of a tomb at Abydos. And the choice of Abydos was itself a feature of the ideology that Den embodied. Chapter 7. The Sinai campaign and the Eastern Desert, the ivory label that shows Den smiting a foreign enemy, is associated, by the scholarly analysis of its inscription, with a military campaign against the inhabitants of the Eastern Desert, the region of the Sinai Peninsula or the territory east of the Delta that was home to pastoral and semi-nomadic populations who occupied the borderlands between Egypt's cultivated valley and the Arabian Desert. The specific nature of these military campaigns, who was being fought, why, and what the specific outcomes were, is only partially recoverable from the evidence. The inscriptions on the labels are brief and often cryptic, using the compressed notation of the early hieroglyphic script in ways that are still not fully understood by specialists. But the general picture is clear enough. Den's reign was characterized by military activity on the eastern frontier, and that military activity was systematically recorded and symbolically framed in the administrative documents of the state. The eastern frontier was significant for several reasons. The Sinai Peninsula was an important source of specific raw materials, turquoise and copper in particular, that the Egyptian state was interested in accessing. The people who occupied the borderlands between Egypt and the Sinai were both a potential threat to the eastern approaches to the delta and a potential source of labor for the mining operations in the Sinai that the Egyptian state would eventually organize on a large scale. The specific character of Den's eastern campaigns, whether they were systematic expeditions to secure mining access, punitive raids against border communities, or territorial expansion, cannot be fully reconstructed from the available evidence. What can be said is that they were significant enough to be recorded in the administrative documentation of the reign, and that the specific image used to record them, the smiting Pharaoh, the divine royal violence against the forces of disorder, was being deliberately deployed to frame the military activities as expressions of the pharaonic legitimacy ideology, rather than simply as practical resource acquisition campaigns. This framing is the significant thing. The choice to represent military activity through the specific image of the smiting Pharaoh, rather than simply recording it as a transaction, as the labels recorded commercial activities, was a choice to make the military activities part of the symbolic program of the pharaonic ideology. Military success against the enemies of Egypt was not simply tactically valuable, it was cosmologically significant. The king who struck down the enemy was performing the specific function of maintaining the divine order against the forces of chaos. The military campaign was also, simultaneously, a ritual performance. This integration of the military and the cosmological, the understanding of the king's military activities as expressions of his divine function, was one of the most important features of the pharaonic ideology, and it is one that the later tradition would develop into the full-blown military ideology of the New Kingdom pharaohs. Thutmose III's campaigns as expressions of Amun's will, Ramesses II's battles as cosmic encounters between divine order and divine chaos, the specific framing of military victory as the maintenance of the universe itself. Den's smiting label was the early expression of this integration. The image that covered the walls of temples 3,000 years later was the mature expression of the same underlying principle. The principle was being worked out in its early form by Den. Chapter 8. The Flood of Material. The German Archaeological Institute has been conducting ongoing excavations at Abydos since the 1970s, and the work continues in the 21st century. The ongoing excavations have continued to yield material that refines and occasionally revises the scholarly understanding of the First Dynasty established by Petrie and Kaiser. The most significant ongoing discovery is the sheer quantity of material that continues to emerge from the site. The royal cemetery and its surroundings have not yet yielded all of their secrets. New subsidiary graves are found in each excavation season. New administrative objects appear in the fill of previously disturbed areas. New architectural features emerge as the excavation reaches previously unexplored portions of the site. In 2012 CE, the German team working at Abydos announced the discovery of a cache of wine jars from the early dynastic period. Sealed jars that still contained the preserved residue of what had once been wine, bearing inscriptions that allowed the archaeologists to date them and to connect them to specific administrative contexts of the period. The discovery of preserved organic residues in early dynastic vessels is itself a significant methodological development. Techniques of chemical analysis that were not available to Petrie can now extract information from the material culture that the traditional stratigraphic analysis could not reach. Wine, specifically, is important for understanding the First Dynasty. Wine was not simply a beverage in the First Dynasty. It was a luxury product, a ritual substance, a specific material expression of the royal economy's connection to the Levantine commercial networks that provided the grape-growing territories from which Egyptian wine was sourced or imported. The wine jars in royal contexts were material evidence of the specific commercial and ritual connections that the early Egyptian state maintained with the wider Mediterranean world. Gunter Dreyer, commenting on the ongoing excavations, described the Abydos site as among the most archaeologically productive in Egypt, for the specific reason that the early dynastic material there has never been fully exhausted by the previous excavations. The looting of the royal tombs in antiquity removed the most valuable portable objects but left, in the fill and in the peripheral areas, an enormous quantity of smaller and less obviously valuable material whose informational content is, for the archaeologist, often more valuable than the objects that the looters preferred. This is the archaeological irony of the ancient world's most comprehensively looted sites. The very thoroughness of the ancient looting of valuable objects often preserves, in the disturbed fill, a richer record of the small-scale, everyday, administratively significant material than would have been preserved if the tombs had been sealed and undisturbed. The looters took the gold and the jewels. They left the labels and the seal impressions and the pottery sherds. And the labels and the seal impressions and the pottery sherds are, for the archaeologists trying to reconstruct the administrative and economic history of the First Dynasty, the most important evidence of all. This is the specific reason why the continued excavation at Abydos continues to produce significant results more than a century after Petrie's first systematic work on the site. The site has not been exhausted. The story of Den and his contemporaries has not been fully told. The ground at Abydos is still yielding its secrets to the patient archaeologist with the systematic methods and the analytical techniques that the 21st century makes available. The most important future discoveries from Abydos have not yet been made. What they will say about Den and the First Dynasty, what they will add to or revise in the picture that this account presents, is genuinely unknown. The story is not finished. It is still being told by the earth. Chapter 9. The Canine Cemetery and the Retainer Graves. Among the more extraordinary discoveries from the Abydos First Dynasty Cemetery is the evidence of animal sacrifices that accompanied some of the royal burials. Dogs, in considerable numbers, were found buried in subsidiary graves associated with certain First Dynasty royal tombs, suggesting that the retainer sacrifice extended, in its early expression, to the animals that had served or been associated with the royal household. Dogs in First Dynasty Egypt were not simply pets. They were working animals, hunting companions, guard animals, perhaps also animals that participated in the specific rituals of the royal court. Their presence in the subsidiary graves of the royal cemetery suggests that the pharaonic ideology's understanding of the king's continuing needs in the afterlife extended to the animals who served the king in specific capacities as well as to the human servants. This detail is, in its specific character, illuminating about the nature of the early pharaonic ideology. The king's afterlife was understood as a continuation of his earthly existence, requiring the same categories of support, maintained by the same categories of dependence, organized around the same patterns of royal activity, including the hunting and other outdoor activities for which dogs would have been useful. The afterlife was not a different kind of existence. It was the same kind of existence, in a different register. This specific understanding of the afterlife, as a continuation rather than a transformation, is different from the later Egyptian understanding, which developed progressively more elaborate cosmological accounts of the king's journey through the underworld, the dangers he faced, the divine assistance he received, and the ultimate nature of his divine existence after death. The early First Dynasty afterlife was more straightforwardly a projection of the earthly royal life into an eternal form. The later tradition became more theologically complex as the specific problems of the initial model generated the need for more sophisticated solutions. The dogs at Abydos are evidence of the initial model, its specific character, its specific assumptions, its specific limitations. They are also, in a more immediate sense, evidence of the specific scale and the specific thoroughness of the funerary ritual that the First Dynasty maintained. The retainer sacrifice was not simply the killing of human servants, it was the wholesale recreation of the royal household in the cemetery. The dogs, the servants, the administrative officials, the craftsmen, the women of the court. The entire court, frozen in its earthly form, reconstituted in the desert sand to serve the king through eternity. Chapter 10. What the labels say about time. One of the most technically sophisticated aspects of the administrative labels from Den's reign is their apparent inclusion of the first systematic use of regnal years in Egyptian administrative records. The earlier First Dynasty labels used specific events, a festival, a military campaign, a notable royal activity, as the reference points within which transactions were dated. Den's labels apparently began to systematize this practice into a numbered sequence of regnal years, providing the administrative infrastructure for a consistent and cumulative chronological record. If this attribution is correct, and the specific scholarly evidence for it is genuine though not beyond debate, Den's reign saw the introduction of the specific chronological framework that would organize Egyptian administrative and historical records for the next 3,000 years. The numbered regnal year, counting from the king's accession, was the basic unit of time in the Egyptian administrative tradition. Every document, every record, every administrative reference was dated in terms of the current king's regnal year. This is not simply a convenient administrative convention. The regnal year as the basic unit of time was an ideological statement about the nature of time itself in the Egyptian tradition. Time did not flow independently of the king's reign, it was organized by it. The king's accession was a new beginning, a specific reset of the temporal framework within which the administrative life of the kingdom was organized. The king's death was not simply a biographical event, it was a temporal disruption, requiring the establishment of a new regnal year framework by the new king. This understanding of time as fundamentally organized around the king's reign rather than around any independent external chronological framework was one of the most specifically Egyptian features of the pharaonic tradition, and it persisted in modified forms for the entire duration of the Egyptian state. The fact that it appears to have been introduced or significantly formalized in Den's reign adds one more element to the picture of a ruler who was, across the full range of his administrative activity, systematically developing the institutional forms of the Egyptian state in ways that would endure for millennia. The numbers are striking. The regnal year system that Den apparently introduced was still the basis of Egyptian administrative chronology more than 3,000 years after his death. Not 3 generations, 3,000 years. A chronological framework introduced in the early First Dynasty was still organizing the administrative life of the Egyptian state in the Ptolemaic period, was still the framework within which Rosetta Stone's decree was dated, within which the Apis bull stelae that anchored the scholarly chronology of the late period were organized. Den's administrative innovations were not small adjustments to a developing system. They were foundational contributions to the framework that sustained the system for 3 millennia. That is the specific scale of his contribution, and it is the contribution that makes the silence around his name, the near total absence of Den, from the popular understanding of Egyptian history. One of the more significant omissions in the public telling of the ancient world's story. He was foundational. He is invisible. This account is one attempt to begin correcting that invisibility. The following sections complete the correction. Chapter 11. The mastaba tombs and the large mastaba tombs at Saqqara, the elaborate First Dynasty burials of the court elite that were for a time misidentified as the royal tombs, deserve their own examination in the context of Den's reign, because the specific character of these tombs is direct evidence for the specific character of the social order that Den's administration both reflected and reinforced. The mastabas at Saqqara were built by officials of the royal court, men whose specific positions in the administrative hierarchy we can partially reconstruct from the labels and seal impressions associated with their tombs. They were the chief stewards of the royal household, the managers of specific estate properties, the officials who supervised the specific categories of tribute and taxation that flowed to the royal economy. They were, in short, the administrative class of the early Egyptian state, the men whose organizational intelligence made the specific institutional achievements of Den's reign possible. The specific character of their tombs, large, elaborately constructed, equipped with significant quantities of grave goods, surrounded, in some cases, by their own retainer burials, demonstrates that the early Egyptian state had developed a substantial administrative class with its own wealth, its own institutional identity, and its own specific relationship to the royal authority. The mastaba tombs were not simply burial places. They were statements about status, about the specific relationship between the official and the royal economy, about the way in which the elite of the Egyptian state understood their own position. The mastabas are evidence of a social order that was, in Den's time, already structured in ways that anticipate the much better documented social orders of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. The royal court, the administrative elite, the specialized craftsmen and farmers and laborers, the specific hierarchical organization of Egyptian society was taking shape in the First Dynasty in ways that the Saqqara mastabas make visible. Den was at the apex of this structure. His tomb at Abydos was its ultimate expression, but the mastabas at Saqqara are the evidence that the structure extended well below the apex, that the administrative class that made the apex possible was itself already organized, wealthy, and institutionally substantial. The specific scale of this administrative class, the number of large mastabas at Saqqara from the First Dynasty period, the variety of administrative titles and positions they represent, the quantity of goods associated with them, is itself evidence of the organizational scale of the First Dynasty state. This was not a simple chiefdom or a tribal structure. It was a genuine administrative state with a differentiated hierarchy, specialized roles, formal titles, and the specific institutional infrastructure that sustains complex governance. Den was the king of this state. The state was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most complex and most organizationally sophisticated political entities that had yet existed anywhere on Earth. 5,000 years ago, that is the scale, that is the achievement. And that is why the pharaoh who first wore the double crown deserves the full accounting that this series has now given him. The deeper truth about Den is the deeper truth about the beginning of things, not the beginning of everything. There were people on the Nile long before Den, farmers and herders and craftsmen who had been living in the valley for thousands of years before the unified Egyptian state existed, not the beginning of civilization in any absolute sense. The Mesopotamian cities of Uruk and Ur were already old by the time Den was building his tomb at Abydos, not even the beginning of Egyptian civilization, which had been developing for centuries before the First Dynasty's founding unification. The deeper truth is about what it means for a civilization to be at the beginning of its specific form, the specific moment when the forms that will define it for 3,000 years are being worked out, when the specific people who will establish those forms are still alive, still making choices, still deciding what Egyptian civilization will be. That moment is extraordinarily rare. Most of us live in civilizations that are already fully formed. Civilizations with established institutions, established symbolic vocabularies, established administrative traditions, established ideological frameworks. We inherit these forms. We may modify them, elaborate them, challenge them, occasionally transform them, but we do not invent them from scratch. We do not live at the specific moment when the forms that will define our civilization for 3 millennia are being established for the first time. Den lived at that moment. He was not simply governing a country. He was contributing, through his specific choices and his specific innovations, to the invention of the specific forms that would define Egyptian civilization, define it so deeply and so durably that those forms would persist, essentially recognizable, for 3,000 years. The double crown title, the smiting pharaoh image, the gnome system, the regnal year framework, the staircase tomb, the granite floor, the systematic administrative labels. Each of these was a specific contribution to the specific invention of what Egyptian civilization would be. Let that sink in. The items on the preceding list are not incidental features of a single historical period. They are the foundational elements of one of the most durable civilizations in the history of the human world, and they were established or significantly advanced by a single ruler in a single reign more than 5,000 years ago. This is extraordinary. It is the kind of extraordinary that tends to become invisible precisely because of its antiquity, because the distance of 5,000 years makes the specific human agency behind the achievements harder to perceive than the achievements themselves. We see the pyramids, and we do not think about the specific administrative innovations that made them possible. We see the pharaonic iconography, and we do not think about the specific moment when the smiting pharaoh image was first used as an administrative convention. We see the hieroglyphic inscriptions, and we do not think about the specific reign in which the writing system was sufficiently developed to produce the standardized administrative records that sustained the Egyptian state for 3 millennia. Den is invisible behind the achievements he helped to produce. This account has been working to make him visible again, to restore the specific human agency behind the founding of Egyptian civilization to its proper place in the story. The deeper truth about Den is also the deeper truth about the relationship between innovation and durability, between the specific choices made at the founding moment and the specific consequences those choices produce across the long history that follows. The pharaonic ideology that Den helped to establish was extraordinarily durable. It lasted 3,000 years in conditions that destroyed most other comparable civilizations. It survived foreign invasions, internal revolts, dynastic discontinuities, cultural transformations, and the progressive absorption of the Egyptian world into the post-Alexander Mediterranean synthesis. The specific forms that the first dynasty established, the double crown, the smiting pharaoh, the Horus name, the administrative structure, were maintained through all of these disruptions with a consistency that has no real parallel in the history of ancient civilizations. Why? What specific quality of the pharaonic ideology made it so durable? The deeper truth is that the pharaonic ideology was successful because it was genuinely integrative, because it combined, in a single coherent system, the practical requirements of governance with the cosmological requirements of legitimacy in a way that made each reinforce the other. The administrative labels were both practical tracking devices and ideological statements. The smiting pharaoh image was both a record of military activity and a cosmological assertion. The gnome system was both an administrative convenience and a spatial expression of the king's comprehensive authority over the organized landscape of the Egyptian world. The integration was the genius, not the specific administrative innovations, which other civilizations also achieved, not the specific symbolic vocabulary, which was distinctive but not unprecedented. The integration, the specific way in which the practical and the cosmological, the administrative and the ritual, the earthly governance and the divine maintenance were woven together into a single coherent system in which each element supported every other, was the specific Egyptian achievement, and it was an achievement that was, in its founding form, worked out in the first dynasty. Den was one of the weavers. The specific quality of his weaving, the specific character of the contributions his reign made to the integration, is visible in the archaeological record in ways that this account has been examining in detail. The administrative labels that bore the Horus name, the smiting image on the administrative object, the granite floor in the tomb that was architecturally connected to the surface through the staircase that allowed the living to maintain ritual connection with the divine dead. Each of these was a specific weaving of the practical and the cosmological, a specific integration of the administrative and the symbolic in a form that reinforced both. This is not science fiction. This is what the archaeological evidence, read carefully, and in the light of the best available scholarly analysis, says about the specific character of Den's reign and the specific nature of his contributions. The evidence is fragmentary. The interpretations are sometimes contested. The conclusions are subject to revision as new material is found. But the broad outlines are clear enough, and clear enough for this account's purposes. Den was a genuinely significant figure in the founding of one of the most important civilizations in human history, and his significance has been largely invisible to the popular understanding of the ancient world. The invisibility is understandable. Den lived at the beginning of recorded history, in the specific sense that the writing system that he helped to develop was barely capable, at the time of his reign, of recording the full range of human language. He left behind no narratives, no accounts of his own thoughts or his own experiences, no documents that would allow us to reconstruct his inner life or his specific motivations. He left behind administrative labels and a tomb, and the physical evidence of a civilization's institutional development. Reading that evidence requires the specific expertise of the archaeologist and the specialist in early Egyptian history. It does not produce the kind of vivid narrative that makes historical figures visible to popular audiences. The lack of narrative visibility is the specific condition of all ancient history at this remove, but it is especially pronounced for the period before writing was fully capable of recording narrative. Den was a man who lived before narrative writing existed in its mature form. His story is told in objects rather than in words, and the objects, for those who know how to read them, tell an extraordinary story. The grief in the story of Den, the specific sorrow that attaches to this account, in the way that every account in this series has carried its own specific sorrow, is not the grief of a civilization ending. Den's civilization was not ending, it was beginning. The grief, if it is grief, is the grief of invisibility, the grief of a man whose specific contributions to the founding of one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history have been largely invisible to the subsequent world that inherited those contributions. He was there. He built things. He established forms. He made choices that determined the character of a civilization that lasted 3,000 years. And most of the people who live in that civilization's intellectual and cultural inheritance, who benefit in ways they cannot fully trace from the specific forms he helped to establish, have never heard his name. Let that sink in one final time. The double crown that his successors wore for 3,000 years, the smiting Pharaoh image that covered temple walls for 3,000 years, the administrative nome system that organized the governance of Egypt for 3,000 years, the regnal year framework that dated every document for 3,000 years. All of these, or all of the foundational versions of these, were contributions that Den made or significantly advanced. And he is, to all but a small circle of specialists, invisible. The invisibility is not deserved. The visibility this account provides is a small beginning at correcting it, but the correction requires saying the name clearly and with the full force of what the name means. Den, the first pharaoh to wear the double crown, the most administratively sophisticated ruler of the first dynasty, the king who built the first granite floor and the first staircase tomb and the first systematic administrative record of the Egyptian state. Den. His name deserves to be known. The deeper truth about the beginning of Egyptian civilization is also the deeper truth about beginnings in general, about what it means to be the specific people who establish the forms that subsequent generations will inherit. The people who establish founding forms are rarely recognized for doing so in the moment of the establishment. The establishment of a form is a specific act that only becomes visible as foundational in retrospect. When enough time has passed to see the form's durability, when enough subsequent history has accumulated to reveal the scope of the consequences. Den's administrative innovations were not understood as foundational innovations in the moment they were made. They were practical responses to the specific governance challenges of the First Dynasty state. The fact that they turned out to be so durable that the specific forms they established would persist for 3,000 years was not visible to the people who established them. This is the specific epistemological challenge of all early institutional development. The people who do the founding work do not know they are founding. They are solving problems, making choices, developing conventions that work well enough to be maintained. The recognition of the founding significance comes later. Comes when the forms have proven their durability, when the generations who inherited them look back and recognize the specific moment when the forms were established. For Egyptian civilization, the first dynasty was the founding moment, and its rulers, Den above all, by the evidence of his specific contributions, were the founders in the most specific sense, the people who established the forms that subsequent generations inherited. There is one more dimension of the deeper truth that this account must address: the question of what Den's story reveals about the relationship between violence and civilization in the founding moment. The retainer sacrifice, the killing of more than 100 people to accompany Den into his afterlife, is not an incidental footnote in his story. It is a central feature of the specific character of the early pharaonic tradition, and the deeper truth requires engaging with it honestly, rather than simply acknowledging it and moving on. The pharaonic ideology that Den helped to establish was not simply a sophisticated administrative system decorated with religious legitimation. It was an ideology of absolute royal power, power so total and so divine that it could require the deaths of people who had organized their lives around service to the king, in service of the king's continuing needs after death. The ideology that produced the architectural and administrative achievements of Den's reign was also the ideology that produced the graves around his tomb. These are not separable facts. They are aspects of the same reality. The administrative sophistication and the retainer sacrifice were both expressions of the same underlying ideology, the ideology of the divine king, whose authority was total and whose needs, in death as in life, trumped the interests and the lives of the people who served him. Subsequent generations abandoned the retainer sacrifice. They kept the administrative sophistication, the symbolic vocabulary, the ideological framework. They found ways to maintain the foundational claims of the pharaonic tradition while eliminating its most extreme and most costly institutional expression. This was a genuine development, a genuine refinement of the tradition, making it more sustainable, more compatible with the long-term interests of the population it governed, and ultimately more durable, precisely because the elimination of the retainer sacrifice removed a specific source of institutional fragility. But the founding moment, the moment when the pharaonic tradition was being established in its earliest and most extreme form, included the retainer sacrifice as one of its constitutive elements. Den was its most elaborate First Dynasty practitioner. The approximately 137 people buried around his tomb were the specific cost of the specific institution he embodied. This fact does not diminish the achievement, but it requires acknowledgement as part of the honest accounting that this series is committed to providing. The most sophisticated governance institution of the ancient world was also, in its founding phase, an institution that required the deaths of the people who served it as the ultimate expression of the king's divine authority. Both things are true. Both deserve to be held together, without either cancelling the other. The deeper truth about Din includes both the extraordinary administrative achievement and the extraordinary human cost of the ideology that drove it. The truth of the beginning includes both the invention and the price of the invention. The price was paid, the invention endured. The civilization it helped to found lasted 3,000 years and shaped, through its legacy in the Ptolemaic synthesis, and its transmission through Greek, Roman, and eventually modern intellectual traditions, the world we inhabit. Den was there. He paid the price, not in his own life, but in the lives of the people who served him. He made the contributions in the administrative labels, the symbolic innovations, the architectural achievements. He established the forms, the double crown, the gnome system, the regnal year, the staircase tomb, that the subsequent 3,000 years would inherit. And now, 5,000 years after he ruled, his name can be spoken with the full force of what it means. Den, the first pharaoh to wear the double crown, the most important ruler of the first dynasty, the man who helped to invent the longest-lived civilization in the history of the ancient world. The deeper truth has been told. The implications and the closing follow. There is a specific connection between the story of Den and the arc of the entire series that this account belongs to, a connection that the series has been building toward through 8 previous accounts and that Den's story makes finally explicit. This series began with the Site period pharaohs Psamtik I, Necher II, Ramesses, who were themselves working out the specific problem of maintaining Egyptian civilization's identity and its institutional foundations in the conditions of the first millennium BC. Mediterranean, they were dealing with the pharaonic tradition as something they had inherited as a framework of forms and institutions and symbolic vocabulary that the preceding 3,000 years of Egyptian history had developed, refined, and transmitted to them. The archiving program of the Site period was, at its deepest level, a reaching back to the oldest available forms, a deliberate reconnection with the founding expressions of the tradition that the accumulated changes of 3,000 years had modified and overlaid. When the Sete artists went back to copy the Old Kingdom originals, to study the proportions, the styles, the specific artistic conventions of the earliest phases of mature Egyptian civilization, they were going back to forms that were themselves already ancient. The Old Kingdom was, for the Sete period, the primary reference for the ancient tradition. The first dynasty, Den's dynasty, was even earlier, already beyond the horizon of what the Sete tradition's archaizing impulse typically reached. But Den was there, before the Old Kingdom, before the pyramids, at the specific founding moment when the forms that both the Old Kingdom and the Site period would later draw on as ancient tradition were themselves being established for the first time. The arc of this series, from the Site period pharaohs through the Ptolemaic synthesis to the crisis of the Rosetta Stone and now back to the founding moment of the First Dynasty, is the arc of a single civilizational tradition examined across its full span. The forms that Den helped to establish at the beginning are the forms that Psamtik I was reaching back to at the end. The administrative infrastructure that Den built is the same administrative infrastructure, in transformed but recognizable form, that sustained the Egyptian state through the Ptolemaic period and beyond. The series has been examining the same civilization from multiple temporal perspectives, from the specific vantage points of its most significant individual moments across 5,000 years of continuous existence. And now, in this account of Den, it examines the founding moment itself, the specific moment when the civilization was establishing the forms that all the subsequent moments would build on. The connection is not metaphorical. It is institutional, material, and historical. The name that appears on the Seric of Den's labels, the Horus name written in the palace facade enclosure, is the same title that Ptolemy V carried in the Memphis decree inscribed on the Rosetta Stone 3,000 years later. The administrative organization of the Egyptian state that Den was systematizing in the First Dynasty was the administrative organization, vastly elaborated and refined but fundamentally continuous, that the Ptolemaic state was managing in the 2nd century BC. The ideological framework of divine kingship that Den embodied and helped to establish was the same ideological framework, modified, synthesized, partly transformed, but fundamentally recognizable, that the Ptolemaic dynasty was maintaining when it issued the Memphis decree in 196 BC. This is the span of the civilizational tradition. This is the scale of the continuity. And Den was at the beginning of it. The pharaoh who wore the double crown first is the pharaoh at whose moment the entire subsequent tradition begins. Understanding him is understanding the beginning of everything that came after. That beginning, and the man at its center, deserves to be known. The scale of what the series has been examining, from Den's founding moment to the Rosetta Stone's crisis, is a scale of approximately 5,000 years. That is a span of time that makes the most ambitious histories of the ancient world look modest. It is a span that encompasses the entire recorded history of most civilizations, and it is the span of a single, continuous civilizational tradition. From the first pharaoh to wear the double crown to the last pharaoh to use the double crown title in the Ptolemaic period. That tradition, its specific character, its specific durability, its specific achievements, and its specific costs, is what this series has been examining. Den is the beginning of the examination in chronological terms, even if he is the last account in the series' published order. He is the founding moment. He is where the story begins. And the story, understood from its beginning, is a story of extraordinary human achievement sustained across an extraordinary span of time by the specific institutional intelligence of a civilization that understood from its very beginning that the integration of the practical and the cosmological was the foundation of durable governance. Den understood this, in whatever way a specific human being in the early First Dynasty could be said to understand anything about the long-term consequences of his specific choices. He governed with a combination of practical and symbolic intelligence that produced results durable enough to outlast him by 3 millennia. He was there at the beginning, doing the work. The deeper truth is that the beginning mattered, that the specific forms established in the founding moment shaped everything that came after, and that the man who established those forms, who wore the double crown, who struck the foreign enemy, who built the staircase tomb and the granite floor, who systematized the administrative labels and the nome system and the regnal year, deserves to be known by name. His name was Den. Now you know it. The implications and the reflection follow, and then the closing. But the deeper truth has been named, and the name has been spoken. The foundation of the series has been laid in the most literal sense. The account of the founder, the Pharaoh who first wore the double crown, the man who built the beginning. The beginning was built by a specific human being, with a specific intelligence, in a specific time and place. That is the deeper truth, and it is the truth that this account has been working to make visible. 5,000 years ago, at the beginning of everything, his name was Den. Step back from the specific story of Den and look at the broadest possible view of what the story reveals. This series of accounts has been examining Egyptian civilization across a span of approximately 5,000 years. From Den's First Dynasty founding moment to the Ptolemaic crisis of the Rosetta Stone, through the late period pharaohs of the Saite dynasty, and back to the dawn of recorded history. Across this span, certain patterns have recurred with a consistency that deserves to be named. The most consistent pattern is the one that the account of the Rosetta Stone made most explicit: the institutional tradition sustaining the civilization through the disruptions and the crises that individual rulers could not prevent. The priestly establishment at Memphis, maintaining the accommodation with the Ptolemaic dynasty through the specific crisis of Ptolemy V. The temple establishments across Egypt, maintaining the thread of Egyptian cultural identity through the Persian occupation, the Macedonian conquest, the Ptolemaic synthesis, the scribal tradition, maintaining the writing system and the administrative conventions that sustained the Egyptian state across 3,000 years of political change. But the series has now arrived at the beginning of that tradition, the specific moment when the institutional forms were being established rather than inherited and maintained. And the view from the beginning reveals something about the tradition that the view from within it, the view of the Saite pharaohs maintaining it, the view of the Ptolemaic rulers adapting it, cannot fully provide. The view from the beginning reveals that the tradition was invented, that the specific forms which later periods would treat as eternal, as natural, as the obviously correct expressions of the divine order, these forms were chosen, in the First Dynasty, by specific people making specific decisions about specific governance challenges. The double crown was not the inevitable expression of a universal truth about Egyptian kingship. It was a specific choice, the choice to formalize in the royal titulary the specific character of the Egyptian kingdom as a unity of two distinct regions. The smiting pharaoh image was not a naturally given representation of royal power. It was a specific choice. The choice to frame military activity in the specific symbolic language of divine violence against chaos, rather than in some other symbolic framework. These choices were made by specific people. Den was among the most important of those people, and the choices were made in conditions where the outcomes were not guaranteed, where it was genuinely uncertain whether the specific forms being developed would prove durable or would be replaced by different forms in subsequent generations. The implication is about the contingency of civilization. The specific ways in which the civilizational traditions we inherit are the products of specific choices made by specific people in specific circumstances rather than the inevitable expressions of some universal law. The pharaonic tradition lasted 3,000 years. That durability can make it seem inevitable, as if Egyptian civilization could not have developed in any other form, as if the double crown and the smiting pharaoh and the nome system were the only possible expressions of Egyptian governance. But they were not inevitable, they were chosen, and the specific quality of the choices made in the first dynasty, the specific integration of the practical and the cosmological that made the pharaonic ideology so durable, was itself a contingent achievement rather than a necessary outcome. This matters for how we think about our own civilizational traditions. The forms we inherit, the institutional frameworks, the symbolic vocabularies, the administrative conventions, are also the products of specific choices made by specific people in specific circumstances. They are not inevitable. They are durable, sometimes extraordinarily durable, because the specific people who made the founding choices made them well enough to produce forms that sustained themselves across the disruptions and the crises of subsequent history. But the durability is not eternity. Even the pharaonic tradition, the most durable of all ancient civilizational traditions, eventually ended in the specific conditions of late antiquity, when the institutional substrate that had maintained it was finally dissolved by the transformations of the Christian and Islamic periods. The tradition lasted 3,000 years. It did not last forever. Nothing does. Den helped to build something that lasted 3,000 years. That is a genuinely extraordinary achievement. It is not diminished by the fact that it eventually ended. It is, if anything, made more remarkable by the specific gap between the founding moment, the first dynasty, approximately 5,000 years ago, and the ending moment, the last hieroglyphic inscription at Philae, approximately 3,600 years after Den died. 3,600 years. That is the span of the tradition from its founding moment to its final institutional expression. It is a span longer than the entire subsequent history of Western civilization from the fall of Rome to the present. Den was at the beginning of this span. The specific forms he helped to establish were the beginning of the tradition that lasted 3,600 years. That is the scale of the implication, and it deserves the full recognition that the silence around Den's name has too long withheld. The second implication concerns what the first dynasty reveals about the relationship between innovation and continuity in the founding of civilizational traditions. The pharaonic tradition was not established by a single generation or a single reign. It was built across the entire first dynasty, and then the second dynasty, and the early Old Kingdom. The accumulated work of specific people across several centuries, each contributing specific innovations, and each inheriting the specific achievements of the generations before. Den was not the founder of the pharaonic tradition in the absolute sense. Nama and Aha and Jie and Jet had all contributed to the development of the tradition before Den came to the throne. Den was the most important single contributor within the first dynasty, by the evidence of his specific administrative and symbolic innovations. But he was one contributor in a cumulative process that took generations to produce the mature form that the subsequent 3,000 years inherited. This cumulative character of civilizational founding is itself an important truth. Great civilizations are not founded by a single genius. They are built, over time, by successive generations of people who each add their specific contributions to a developing tradition. The tradition accumulates. The innovations of each generation become the inherited forms of the next. The founders, in this specific sense, are plural. They are the entire sequence of people who contributed to the establishment of the forms that proved durable enough to become the tradition. Den was among the most important of these plural founders. But he was not alone, and his importance does not diminish the contributions of the others who came before and after him. The final implication is the most direct and the most personal. It concerns the relationship between the silence around Den and the silence around all the earliest contributors to the traditions we have inherited. Every civilizational tradition has its founding moment, the specific period when its characteristic forms were being established. Every founding moment involved specific people who made specific choices that shaped the tradition for subsequent generations. Most of those people are unknown. Most of their names have not survived. Most of their specific contributions are invisible to us because the documentary record of the founding moment is, almost by definition, the thinnest part of the record. Because writing was either not yet fully developed or was too new to leave the thick documentary trail that more mature periods leave, or because the physical materials of the founding period were less durable than the materials of later periods. Den is one of the very few founding moment figures who has left enough material evidence for us to know his name, to trace his specific contributions, to tell his specific story. He is, in this sense, exceptional among the founding figures of ancient civilizations, visible where most are invisible, nameable where most are nameless. The specific accident of this visibility, the specific combination of the Abydos cemetery's preservation conditions, Petrie's methodological innovations, Dreyer's systematic subsequent work, and the cumulative scholarly effort of a century and more of early dynastic research, is itself a form of the accidental preservation that this series has repeatedly identified as the mechanism through which the ancient world speaks to the present. Den's name survived, the tradition he helped to found survived, and now, through this account, both the name and the tradition it represents are being given the full recognition that 5,000 years of civilizational significance deserves. The founding moment, the founding figure, the beginning of everything that came after. His name was Den. The reflection that this account most urgently invites, the specific philosophical pause that the story of Den creates, is a reflection about time. 5,000 years is a span that the human mind struggles to hold as genuinely past. The most recent pharaoh described in this series, Ptolemy V, who issued the Memphis decree in 196 BC, lived approximately 2,200 years ago. That span is itself almost unimaginably long by most human standards. Den lived another 3,000 years before that. 8,200 years is not the relevant figure, because Den did not live 8,200 years ago. He lived approximately 5,000 years ago, but the point stands. The distance between Den's world and our world is a distance that makes the most distant events of the rest of this series look recent. Ptolemy V was a contemporary by comparison, and yet Den is not simply distant. He is present, in the specific ways that this account has been tracing, in the nome system that organized Egyptian governance for 3,000 years, in the smiting pharaoh image that covered temple walls across the same span, in the regnal year framework that dated every administrative document, in the staircase tomb that established an architectural principle that the pyramids would develop into their mature form. He is present in the specific tradition that the rest of this series has been examining. He is the beginning of the story that Psamtik and Necho and Amasis and Nectanebo and Ptolemy were all continuing. His specific presence, invisible as it is to the popular understanding of the ancient world, underlies everything that this series has described. This is the deepest implication of including Den's account in this series. It says, the story of Egyptian civilization does not begin with the pyramids. It does not begin with the New Kingdom Empire, or the Sate Renaissance, or the Ptolemaic synthesis. It begins in the desert at Abydos, 5,000 years ago, with a man who wore the double crown for the first time, and who understood, or was developing the understanding, that the forms he was establishing would define everything that followed. He was right, the forms endured, the tradition persisted, and the tradition, across its full span of 3,000 years, produced some of the most extraordinary human achievements in the history of civilization. Den was at the beginning of all of it. The reflection closes here. The account moves to its final words. The series that began with Psamtik I, restoring the pharaonic tradition from Assyrian occupation with patient institutional intelligence, has now reached the point where that tradition began, the specific moment when the pharaonic tradition itself was being established for the first time. The arc is complete. The beginning has been given its full accounting alongside the middle and the end. Den at the beginning, Ptolemy V at the moment of crisis, Psamtik at the restoration, Nectar Nebo at the last native expression, Amasis at the peak, Ptolemy II at the civilizational high point. The full arc of a tradition that lasted 3,000 years, traced in the specific stories of the specific people who most shaped it. That is the series. That is the reflection. The closing follows. The tomb at Abydos is still there. Not the tomb as it was. The burial chamber has been opened since antiquity. Its wooden roofing collapsed. Its granite floor partially displaced by the ancient looters who removed the most valuable objects and left behind the fill that Petrie and Dreyer would later recover. Not the staircase as it was. The stone steps are there in partial form. But the complete descent that allowed the living to maintain ritual connection with the divine dead has been interrupted by 5,000 years of desert weathering, occasional flooding, and the accumulated disturbance of antiquity's grave robbers and the more recent excavations that followed. But the location is there. The desert plateau west of the Nile, in the region of modern Sohag Governorate, where the early pharaohs of Egypt chose to establish their eternal resting places. The low mounds that mark the original surfaces of the royal tombs. The excavation trenches that Petrie dug in 1900 CE, re-examined by Dreyer and his team across the following century. The desert sand and the limestone and the traces of mud brick and the scattered stone that are what 5,000 years does to the most ambitious building project that the world of 3000 BC could produce. It is there, the tomb that Den built, the space where the double crown was laid down for the last time, the place where the staircase once descended, and the granite floor once gleamed, and the approximately 137 people who had organized their lives around the service of the divine king were buried alongside him so that the service could continue forever. The service did not continue forever. Nothing does. The tomb was looted. The roofing collapsed. The body of the king, whatever specific form it was in when it was laid on that granite floor, has not survived the specific indignities of 5,000 years of Egyptian desert conditions, of ancient robbery, of the collapse of the burial chamber that any excavation can now observe. Den is not there. What is there is the evidence of his presence, the traces of the specific institution he built, preserved well enough by the specific conditions of the desert and the specific care of the archaeologists who have worked the site to allow the reconstruction of the story this account has told. The answer to the title question, who was Den, the first pharaoh to wear the double crown, is now as complete as the available evidence allows. He was the fifth king of the first dynasty of Egypt, ruling in the period around 2900 to 2800 BC, according to current scholarly estimates. Approximately 5,000 years ago, he was the ruler under whose reign the double crown title, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, was first used as a formal component of the royal titulary, establishing the specific dual character of Egyptian kingship in a form that would persist for 3,000 years. He was the ruler under whose reign the nome system of administrative geographic organization was introduced or significantly formalized, creating the spatial infrastructure of Egyptian state governance that lasted 3 millennia. He was the ruler under whose reign the regnal year framework for administrative chronology was established or significantly systematized. He was the ruler who commissioned the first granite architectural element in Egyptian history, the floor of his burial chamber at Abydos, and who designed or implemented the staircase entrance to the royal tomb, an architectural innovation that expressed in physical form the continuing connection between the living and the divine dead. He was the ruler whose smiting pharaoh image, depicted on an administrative label found in his tomb, represents one of the earliest systematic uses of the iconographic vocabulary that would cover Egyptian temple walls for 3,000 years. He was the ruler who built the most elaborate tomb of the First Dynasty period, surrounded by more than 100 retainer burials, expressing in the specific extreme form of the early pharaonic tradition. The understanding that the divine king's death was a cosmological event of sufficient significance to require the deaths of those who had served him. He was the ruler whose administrative class, visible in the elaborate mastaba tombs at Saqqara, demonstrates the organizational scale and the institutional sophistication of the early Egyptian state. He was the ruler under whose reign the Egyptian writing system was crossing the threshold from a limited administrative notation into a fully functional language encoding system. He was the ruler whose administrative labels represent the most systematic surviving record of the early Egyptian state's resource tracking and governance activity. He was, in short, the most administratively sophisticated and the most institutionally significant ruler of the first dynasty of Egypt, the founder of forms that would define the Egyptian civilizational tradition for 3,000 years. He has been almost entirely invisible to the popular understanding of the ancient world. The desert around Abydos is very quiet in the early morning. Before the tourist groups arrive, before the excavation teams begin their day's work, before the particular quality of Egyptian summer heat descends, the desert is quiet in a way that places very close to the beginning of recorded human history tend to be quiet. Not the emptiness of places where nothing has happened, the weight of places where extraordinary things happened a very long time ago, and the silence that settled in afterward has been undisturbed for so long that the silence itself has become part of the place. You can stand at the edge of the royal necropolis at Abydos and be standing at the edge of recorded history. The mounds that mark the royal tombs are low. They do not announce themselves. The desert reclaims everything that is not actively maintained, and the tombs of the first dynasty rulers have been absorbed back into the desert in the way that everything eventually is, given enough time and given the specific conditions of the Egyptian desert, which are more forgiving than most desert conditions to the survival of material evidence, but not forgiving enough to preserve the full reality of what was once built there. But the evidence is in the ground. The labels are in museum collections across the world. The granite from Den's tomb floor is in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The smiting label is in the collection of the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology in London. And the scholars who have spent their careers working through this evidence have produced, cumulatively, and in the specific scholarly literature that most people will never read, the most complete picture of Den and the First Dynasty that any generation of scholars has yet assembled. This account has attempted to carry that picture from the scholarly literature to the general audience that deserves to know it. The attempt is incomplete. No single account can fully convey the complexity and the richness of the evidence for a period that has been the subject of sustained specialist study for more than a century, but the attempt was worth making. Den lived at the beginning of everything that came after. The tradition he helped to found lasted 3,000 years. The civilization that tradition sustained was one of the most extraordinary in the history of the human world, and the specific forms he established, the double crown, the administrative labels, the gnome system, the staircase tomb, were the first expressions of an institutional and symbolic vocabulary that 3,000 years of subsequent Egyptian history would elaborate, refine, and finally preserve in the form of the hieroglyphic inscriptions on the temple walls of Karnak and Luxor and Edfu and Philae that stand today, readable to anyone who has learned the writing system that the Rosetta Stone unlocked. The writing system was in its infancy when Den was governing. The temples were not yet built. The pyramids were still 2 generations in the future. The tradition was still being invented. And Den was there, at the beginning, wearing the double crown for the first time. Look at the desert at Abydos differently. Look at it as the place where one of the most important human achievements in history was accomplished. Not in a single dramatic event, but in the cumulative work of generations of specific people, the most important of whom, in the First Dynasty, was a king named Den. His name was Den. He was the first pharaoh to wear the double crown. He built the beginning, and now you know it. The labels are in the museum. The granite is in Cairo. The mounds are in the desert. The tradition is in the civilization that inherited it. In every temple inscription, every administrative convention, every expression of the pharaonic ideology that the subsequent 3,000 years of Egyptian history produced, Den built the beginning of all of it. 5,000 years ago, at the beginning of recorded history, wearing the double crown for the first time. The beginning. the man at its center, the tradition he helped to found. His name was Den, the first pharaoh to wear the double crown, the king at the beginning of everything. Now you know it.